Hello, and welcome back to the campfire. I am really glad you could join me tonight. Before we sink into the darkness of our first story, I want to thank you for being here. Today, we are going to look at a series of events from the 1970s that will make you look twice at every passing car on the road. If you find these stories as haunting as I do, go ahead and gently nudge that like button. Just a light tap is all it takes. We do not want to wake the neighbors or whatever might be creeping around your backyard right now, but we definitely want them to know we are awake and we are watching. While you are at it, please take a moment to make sure your front door is actually locked. Maybe check the live feed on your doorbell camera just to be safe. It is a quiet night out there, and as we have learned many times before, that is usually when the world decides to take a very dark turn. We have a lot of ground to cover today, stretching from the isolated highways of New Zealand to the crowded apartments of Japan and the mountains of Romania. So, settle in, get comfortable, and keep your ears open. You are listening to a chain of events that truly changed history forever. Imagine a crime where the primary piece of evidence is a giant neon orange sign that everyone in the country is looking for. Imagine a car so bright and so distinct that it is physically impossible to miss even from a mile away. Now, imagine that car driving down a single narrow highway on a small island nation where there are only so many places to go. You have dozens of people watching it, you have the make, the model, and the color, and yet, when the police check every single vehicle of that type in the entire country, they find that the one everyone saw simply does not exist. On the morning of June 1st, 1975, the North Island of New Zealand was waking up to a beautiful, crisp winter day. It was the Queen's birthday holiday weekend, which meant the roads were packed with families heading out for one last adventure before the heavy frost set in. In the city of Hamilton, an 18-year-old girl named Mona Blades was standing in her room, packing the last of her things into a large canvas bag. She was vibrant, full of life, and she was keeping a very exciting secret. She was about to head to Napier to surprise her parents for the long weekend. Mona was the kind of person who felt at home everywhere she went. She was savvy, independent, and she absolutely loved the freedom of the open road. Because she did not have a vehicle of her own, she decided to do what thousands of young Kiwis did back then. She put on her favorite platform, shoes, grabbed her orange and brown pack, and headed to the edge of town to catch a ride. In the 1970s, hitchhiking in New Zealand was not a gamble. It was a social institution. It was a way to meet people and share a story while moving from one town to the next without a care in the world. A friend dropped Mona off at the busy Cambridge turnoff around 9 o'clock that morning. The two of them stood on the gravel shoulder, laughing and talking as the morning sun began to warm the air. When her friend finally drove away, she looked back in the rearview mirror and saw Mona waving her bright backpack resting at her feet. She looked like the very definition of 1970s youth and safety. There was no sense of dread, no feeling that anything was wrong. Mona was just a girl waiting for a friendly face to pull over and help her get home to her family for a celebration. The traffic was steady and it did not take long for someone to stop. About an hour and a half later, a truck driver spotted Mona near a town called Putaruru. He watched as she climbed into the passenger seat of a very specific car. It was a 1960s Morris Traveler station wagon. These cars were famous for their wooden structural framing on the back half, giving them a classic rustic look. But this one was unique. It was painted a loud neon shade of orange. It was the kind of car that stood out like a flare in the middle of a dark ocean. You could not look at it without remembering it. Inside that car was a middle-aged man with thinning hair. To the truck driver, it looked like a perfectly normal interaction. Mona was smiling as she settled into the seat, and the car pulled back onto the road, its small engine buzzing as it joined the stream of holiday travelers heading south. They were heading toward the Taupo region, a place where the landscape turns into a vast expanse of pine forests and ancient volcanic craters. The roads there are long and straight, cutting through miles of timberlands where the trees grow so close together that they create a wall of deep, dark shadows. As the orange car moved further into the plateau, it was spotted again and again. Because of its color, witnesses could remember the exact time and place they saw it. A family driving to Lake Taupo saw it parked in a small gravel rest area on the side of the highway near Matea Road. They remembered it because the neon orange paint was such a jarring eyesore against the deep green of the forest. They saw Mona standing near the open passenger door, looking through her bag as if she were searching for a map. The man was standing near the hood. She looked calm. She looked safe. This rest area was the last place anyone would ever see Mona Blades or that bright orange Morris Traveler. It is a strange thing to say about a car that is essentially a moving landmark, but from that gravel turnout, the vehicle simply evaporated. It did not pass through the next town, it did not pull into any gas stations, it did not appear on any of the side roads that led to the coast. In a country that is essentially a series of islands, a neon orange car had somehow found a way to drive off the face of the earth while being watched by an entire nation of holiday travelers. When Mona failed to show up at her parents' house in Napier that evening, the celebration turned into a nightmare. Her parents knew immediately that something was wrong. Mona was reliable, and she was excited for this trip. Her father called the police, and by the next morning, the largest missing persons hunt in the history of New Zealand was underway. It was called Operation Mona. The police were confident. They had a description of a car that was one of a kind. They figured they would find it in a garage or abandoned in the woods within 24 hours. They were very wrong. The investigation that followed was a masterpiece of frustration. The police took the extraordinary step of tracking down every single Morris Traveler registered in New Zealand. There were over 500 of them. They went to every house, every farm, and every scrapyard. They checked blue ones, white ones, and red ones. They interviewed every owner to see where they were on June 1st. But they never found a single orange one that matched the witnesses' descriptions. It was as if the car itself was a ghost, a physical impossibility that hundreds of people had somehow imagined. The search teams moved into the pine forests of the Taupo region, walking in long, disciplined lines through the thick gorse and needles. They used military helicopters with thermal sensors and sent divers into the icy depths of the mountain streams. They searched every old logging track and every hidden pumice cave. They were looking for a bright orange car or a bright orange backpack, things that should have been incredibly easy to see from the air. But the forest held on to its secrets. They found absolutely nothing. Not a shoe, not a scrap of canvas, and not a single tire track. As the weeks turned into months, the atmosphere in New Zealand changed. The carefree culture of the 70s began to rot. Parents who used to let their children hitchhike or walk miles alone suddenly became terrified. The sight of a lone person on a highway shoulder became a source of anxiety. Mona's disappearance had stolen the country's sense of fundamental security. People started to realize that even on a bright, sunny holiday weekend, you could step into a car and simply cease to exist. The orange car became a national legend, a warning that some shadows never leave. The case eventually went cold, but the obsession did not. For decades, whenever a new road was built or a foundation was dug in the Taupo area, people would gather to watch, wondering if the orange Morris would finally be unearthed. There were theories that the car had been pushed into a deep, undiscovered volcanic sinkhole, or that it had been repainted in a hidden shed and driven onto a cargo ship, but no evidence ever surfaced. The driver with the thinning hair and the neon car remained a mystery that defied every rule of logic and every effort of the law for over 50 years. Even today, the name Mona Blades is spoken with a sense of quiet dread. Her story serves as a permanent marker for the day New Zealand lost its innocence. It is a reminder that you can be standing in the middle of a crowd in the most visible vehicle on the road and still be swallowed by a darkness that does not follow the laws of physics. The orange car remains a ghost of the highway, a bright afterimage that lingers in the eyes of everyone who was on the road that day. It is a mystery that has no ending, only a long, silent road that leads into the woods. The silence that settled over that New Zealand highway was heavy and permanent, but it was nothing compared to the silence that was about to fall over a crowded apartment complex in Japan. While Mona vanished into the open air of the forest, our next story takes us to a place where the walls are so thin that every sound becomes a shared secret. In that world, a different kind of obsession was brewing, one that would turn a mundane neighborly dispute into a tragedy that would rewrite the laws of a nation. It all started with the simple rhythmic sound of a child practicing a piano. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon on August 28th, 1974, in the city of Kawaguchi, Japan, a 35-year-old woman named Mrs. Okamura was standing in her kitchen preparing a small snack for her children. The air inside their apartment was thick and heavy with the oppressive humidity of a typical Japanese summer. Outside, the rhythmic buzzing drone of cicadas was almost deafening. But inside apartment 402, that natural noise was being drowned out by something much more rhythmic and intentional. The Okamura family lived in a massive gray concrete housing complex known as a danchi. These buildings were the symbols of Japan's post-war miracle, designed to pack thousands of families into efficient modern spaces. But there was a hidden cost to this efficiency that everyone who lived there understood but rarely talked about. The walls were so thin that you didn't just live with your own family, you lived with the sounds of everyone around you. You heard their footsteps, their television programs, and their muffled arguments. In the small living room, Mrs. Okamura's 8-year-old daughter was sitting at a brand new upright piano. In 1970s, Japan owning a piano was a massive status symbol. It meant you were investing in your child's future and that your family was climbing the social ladder. The little girl was focused, her small fingers moving carefully across the ivory keys as she practiced her basic scales. Do, re, mi, fa, sol. Then she would stop, hesitate, and start the sequence over again from the beginning. To Mrs. Okamura, the sound was beautiful. It represented her hopes for her children's education and refinement, but as she moved about the kitchen, she noticed something that made her pause. Every time her daughter hit a particularly high note, there was a faint, sharp, metallic vibration coming from the wall that connected their unit to apartment 403. It wasn't a loud sound, just a tiny rhythmic rattle, as if something on the other side was being shaken by the frequency of the music. The neighbor in 403 was a 46-year-old man named Ohama Jiro. He lived alone, worked long shifts as a laborer, and was known by the other residents as a quiet, almost invisible figure. He never made trouble, and he never joined in the neighborhood gossip. However, over the past few weeks, the atmosphere between the two apartments had begun to change. It started with small things, a heavy thud against the wall when the girls played too loudly, or a lingering stare in the hallway. Mrs. Okamura had tried to be a good neighbor. She had even gone over to Ohama's door to apologize for the noise, explaining that the girls were just starting their lessons and would only practice during the daytime hours. Ohama hadn't shouted at her. He had simply stood behind his slightly cracked door, his eyes dark and sunken from lack of sleep, and told her that the sound of the piano felt like a physical needle pressing into his brain. He said the repetition was the worst part, like a clock that never stopped. At the time, Mrs. Okamura had explained it away with ordinary logic. She thought he was just a grumpy, middle-aged man who worked too hard and didn't understand what it was like to raise children. She told herself that as long as they followed the building's rules regarding quiet hours, everything would be fine. But as she stood in her kitchen on that sweltering August afternoon, she felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. The cicadas outside had gone silent for a moment, making the sound of the piano seem much louder. In the neighboring apartment, Ohama Jiro was not sleeping. He was sitting on the floor of his darkened room, his back pressed against the concrete wall that separated him from the Okamura family. He hadn't been to work in 3 days. He couldn't eat, and every time he closed his eyes, he heard the ghost of a piano scale. To him, the sound wasn't music. It was a calculated rhythmic torture designed to drive him out of his home. He felt as if the walls themselves were beginning to close in on him. He had complained to the building management, but they had told him that daytime music was perfectly legal. He had called the police, but they had laughed and told him to buy some earplugs. Every avenue of escape had been blocked, and the constant repetitive scales continued to vibrate through his skull. On this afternoon, as the 8-year-old girl hit the same wrong note for the 10th time in a row, something inside Ohama's mind didn't just crack it completely shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Inside apartment 402, the 4-year-old younger sister was playing on the floor with her dolls, occasionally giggling at her sister's mistakes. Mrs. Okamura was just about to call them for their snack when she heard a very soft, very deliberate clicking sound coming from the front door. It wasn't the sound of a knock. It was the sound of a key being slowly turned in a lock that should have been secured. She froze her hand, still holding a small plate, her heart beginning to hammer. She realized with a jolt of pure terror that in the heat of the afternoon, she had left the door unlocked to catch whatever faint breeze might come through the hallway. She watched the handle move. It turned slowly, almost gracefully, as if the person on the other side wanted to make sure they didn't interrupt the music. The door swung open, and Ohamajiro stepped into the entryway. He wasn't screaming, he wasn't even breathing hard. He was carrying a long, thin sashimi knife that glinted in the light. Mrs. Okamura didn't have time to scream. She lunged toward her children, her only thought being to shield them from the man who looked like he was walking in a dream. But the small, cramped nature of the apartment that had once felt so efficient now felt like a trap. There were no back exits, no places to hide. The very furniture they had worked so hard to buy now blocked her path. She felt her legs go numb, her breath coming in short, jagged gasps as the reality of the danger finally sank in. The attack was swift and horrifyingly methodical. Ohama didn't waste energy on words. He moved through the apartment like he was performing a ritual, his eyes fixed on the source of the noise. The piano music stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound that would haunt the residents of the Danchi for decades. By the time the neighbors realized that the sounds coming from apartment 402 weren't the usual noises of a busy family, the hallway had fallen into a heavy, suffocating silence. When the father of the family arrived home from work later that evening, he found the building surrounded by police cars with their blue and red lights flashing against the gray concrete. He ran toward the entrance, his mind racing with 1,000 different fears, but nothing could have prepared him for what he found. Taped to the railing of the stairwell, right next to his front door, was a handwritten note on a piece of simple notebook paper. It was a manifesto written in a cramped, trembling hand. The note ranted about the arrogance of the loud and the suffering of the silent. It claimed that the world had become a place where people no longer cared about the peace of their neighbors, and that a sacrifice had to be made to teach the city a lesson about the sanctity of silence. Ohamajiro had waited in the hallway for the police to arrive, sitting quietly on his own doorstep with the knife resting in his lap. He told the officers that for the first time in years, his head felt perfectly clear. This tragedy sent shockwaves through Japanese society. It exposed a deep hidden friction in the country's rapid urbanization and led to a complete overhaul of national civil laws regarding noise pollution. The term sensory overload crime entered the public lexicon, and apartment construction standards were changed to include mandatory acoustic barriers. But for the survivors and the neighbors, the change came too late. The apartment where the music had once played was boarded up and left empty for a long time. For months afterward, the residents of the Danchi reported hearing faint, ghostly piano scales echoing through the ventilation shafts in the middle of the night. They would lie awake in their own beds, staring at their own thin walls, wondering if the person on the other side was listening to them too. The once coveted modern apartments now felt like psychological pressure cookers where the smallest sound could be the trigger for a nightmare that no amount of concrete could ever truly block out. The silence that Ohamajiro sought was ultimately a hollow victory, a quiet that was built on a foundation of permanent loss and regret. He would spend the rest of his life in a prison cell, a place where the only sounds were the rattling of bars and the distant rhythmic dripping of water. But while that man created a tragedy out of the sound of a piano, a different kind of silence was about to descend upon a mountain valley in Romania where the earth itself was preparing to speak. At 4 o'clock on a freezing morning in late October of 1971, a 34-year-old man named Andre was sound asleep in his warm bed in the small town of Certej, Romania. Andre was a dedicated worker at the local gold mine, and his life was exactly what the state promised a hardworking citizen should have. He lived in a brand new 5-story concrete apartment block that stood as a symbol of modern industrial stability in the heart of the valley. To Andre and his neighbors, this valley felt like the safest place on Earth. The surrounding mountains were tall and protective, and the gold mine provided everything the community needed. It was a predictable, quiet existence where everyone knew their place. The apartment buildings were solid and gray, representing the strength of the communist government. On this particular night, a thick autumn fog had settled over the town, muffling the sounds of the distant machinery at the mine. As Andre slept, his wife and 2 young children were tucked in down the hall, their breathing slow and steady. This was the kind of peace that comes from knowing exactly what tomorrow will look like. The mine was the lifeblood of the town, and its massive tailings dam, located high above them on the slope, was simply part of the landscape. Nobody ever thought of the thousands of tons of chemical runoff sitting behind those walls as a threat. It was just a byproduct of progress. However, at precisely 4:35 a.m., something changed in the atmosphere. It wasn't a loud noise at first, but rather a shift in the way the air felt. In the courtyard below Andre's window, a neighborhood dog began to howl. It wasn't a normal bark at a passing cat or a stranger. It was a high-pitched, primal scream of pure terror that cut through the silence of the valley. The sound was so desperate and unusual that Andre's eyes snapped open in the darkness. He lay there for a moment, his heart starting to thump against his ribs. The dog continued to shriek, and then Andre felt a strange vibration under his pillow. It wasn't a sudden jolt like an earthquake, but a low-frequency hum that seemed to be coming from deep within the ground. He sat up and rubbed his face, trying to shake off the fog of sleep. He looked at the bedside clock and saw the glowing numbers. It was almost time for his shift, but something felt very wrong. Andre stepped out of bed, his bare feet hitting the cold floorboards. He walked to the window and pulled back the heavy curtains, squinting into the gray morning light. The fog was so dense he could barely see the street lamps below. As he stood there, he noticed a faint, bitter smell in the air. It was a sharp chemical scent that reminded him of the processing plant at the mine, but it was much stronger here than it should have been. It smelled like sulfur and burning plastic. He was about to turn back to wake his wife when he heard it. It was a sound that didn't belong in a quiet mountain valley. At first, it sounded like a heavy freight train was approaching from the woods, but there were no tracks in that direction. The sound grew louder and deeper, turning into a terrifying roar that made the glass in his window panes rattle in their frames. The low hum in the floor had turned into a violent shaking that made his knees buckle slightly. Andre realized then that the sound wasn't coming from a train, it was the sound of the mountainside moving. High above the town, the massive tailings dam had silently failed. 300,000 cubic meters of thick, toxic mud and cyanide-laced water had burst through the containment walls. This wasn't just water, it was an acidic sludge, a heavy gray soup of industrial chemicals that had the consistency of wet concrete and the weight of 1,000 lead walls. Before he could even shout a warning to his family, the toxic wave hit the edge of the town. The velocity was incredible. Because the sludge was so heavy, it didn't just flood the buildings, it erased them. The first things to go were the individual wooden homes near the base of the slope. They were crushed instantly, their timbers snapping like toothpicks. Then the wave reached the apartment blocks. Andre felt his entire building lurch as if it had been struck by a massive ship. The impact was so violent that the bottom 2 floors of the apartment building were filled with mud in less than 10 seconds. The people sleeping in those lower units never had a chance to wake up. They were suffocated in their beds by the weight of the toxic sludge. Andre's unit was on the 4th floor, and he watched in horror as the floor beneath him began to tilt at a sickening angle. He could hear the screams of his neighbors through the walls mixed with the sound of grinding stone. He lunged for his children's room, but the force of the building shifting threw him against the wall. He scrambled up his fingers, numb with shock, and managed to reach his children. They were wide-eyed and crying confused by the sudden chaos. Outside the window, the fog had been replaced by a churning sea of gray mud that was carrying away cars, trees, and pieces of other houses. The smell of cyanide was now overwhelming, making his eyes sting and his throat burn. Andre gathered his family in the center of the room, praying that the concrete structure would hold. For several minutes, they listened to the sound of the world being torn apart. The roar of the mud was joined by the sound of snapping power lines and the groans of the building's foundation. It felt like they were on a small island in the middle of a nightmare. When the sound finally began to fade into a low gurgle, Andre looked out the window again and gasped. The landscape he had known his entire life was gone. Where there had been streets and gardens, there was now a flat, smoking expanse of gray sludge. 6 apartment blocks had been completely obliterated. Dozens of homes were missing entirely. The only thing left in the wake of the wave was a haunting silence, broken only by the distant calls for help echoing through the fog. Andre knew he had to get his family out before the building collapsed further or the chemicals poisoned them. They managed to climb down the precarious remains of the stairwell, their boots sinking into the thick, burning mud that had coated everything. The sludge was so acidic that it began to eat through their clothes and sting their skin. As they reached the street level, Andre saw something that chilled him more than the disaster itself. Through the lifting fog, he saw long convoys of military trucks and black sedans arriving from the direction of the regional capital. These weren't ambulances or rescue teams. These were men in long, dark coats, the Securitate, the state's secret police. Before the survivors could even begin to look for their missing loved ones, the soldiers began to cordon off the area. They didn't start digging for survivors immediately. Instead, their first priority was to seize any cameras from the residents. They moved through the crowds, their faces cold and expressionless, demanding that no one speak about what had happened. Andre watched as the secret police went to the local hospital and the town's administrative office. They didn't ask how they could help, they went straight for the logs and the intake records. While the miners were using their bare hands to claw through the acidic mud to find their children, the government officials were busy crossing out names and changing dates. They were treating the tragedy not as a human disaster, but as a political threat to the image of the state. In the days that followed, the true horror of the cover-up began to emerge. The official news report issued by the government stated that the death toll was exactly 89 people. Andre and everyone else in Certage knew that was a lie. They had seen the 6 apartment blocks disappear. They knew how many families lived in those buildings. They knew that the local school was missing nearly half its students. But in 1971 Romania, the truth was whatever the state said it was. The reason for the number 89 was chillingly bureaucratic. Under the current regulations, if a disaster resulted in more than 90 deaths, the local authorities were required to report the incident directly to the Soviet leadership in Moscow and declare a national day of mourning. To avoid the embarrassment of admitting their engineering had failed so spectacularly, the officials simply froze the death toll. They told families that their missing relatives had relocated or were unaccounted for. Andre and the other survivors were forced back to work in the mine only a few weeks later. They were told that the water was safe and that the disaster was a freak accident of nature, not a failure of the dam. If anyone spoke about the real number of casualties, which independent researchers later estimated to be over 300, they were visited by the Securitate and threatened with imprisonment. The town was forced to live in a state of enforced amnesia, walking over the graves of their neighbors. Years later, after the fall of the regime, forensic teams finally entered the valley. They found the remains of the homes buried deep beneath the hardened layer of mud, confirming the stories the survivors had whispered for decades. The golden promise of the valley had been a lie, and the concrete walls that Andre thought were so safe had turned out to be a tomb. The memory of that toxic wave remains a permanent scar on the land, a reminder of what happens when a state values its image more than its people. The silence that was forced upon the people of Certage was a heavy, suffocating weight that lasted for a generation, but for a woman in the Netherlands, silence was the only tool she had to survive a very different kind of nightmare. She was about to find herself trapped in a room where her only hope for freedom lay in her ability to listen to the world she could no longer see. At exactly 8 o'clock in the evening on a cool, rainy Tuesday in January of 1974, a woman named Toos Vandervalk was sitting in the comfortable living room of her secluded villa in the Netherlands. Toos was the wife of a very successful man whose name was known by almost every traveler in Western Europe because they owned a massive chain of motels and restaurants. Their brand was a symbol of reliability and hospitality for thousands of people. For years, the Van der Valk family had lived a life that was both affluent and remarkably open. Because they worked in the hospitality industry, they believed in a world where doors should be welcoming and neighbors were friends. Their home reflected this philosophy with large glass windows that looked out over the manicured gardens and no heavy security fences. Tooze was enjoying a quiet moment after dinner, listening to the soft patter of rain against the glass. As she reached for a book on the coffee table, a sudden sound interrupted the peaceful evening. It was a sharp, crystalline pop, like a bird hitting a window, followed by the unmistakable sound of shattering glass in the adjacent patio room. Tooze froze her hand, hovering over the book. Her first thought was that a heavy branch had fallen in the wind, but the air in the room suddenly felt different, as if a vacuum had been breached and something cold was rushing in. Before she could even call out to her husband, the heavy velvet curtains at the edge of the living room were thrust aside. Three men stood there, their forms silhouetted against the dim garden light. They were wearing dark woolen ski masks that completely obscured their faces, leaving only narrow, predatory slits for their eyes. They did not move like burglars looking for jewelry, they moved like soldiers executing a practiced and coordinated tactical maneuver. One of the men held a finger to his lips, a gesture that was terrifyingly calm in its silence. Within seconds, they had moved across the room and subdued her family with efficient, practiced movements. Tooze felt a pair of rough hands pull her arms behind her back, and then a thick, dark piece of fabric was tied tightly over her eyes. The world she had known just moments ago, the warm light and the familiar furniture, was instantly replaced by total, suffocating blackness. She was lifted off her feet and carried out into the cold night air. She could hear the wet gravel crunching under the boots of the men, and then she felt the cold, hard metal floor of a van beneath her. The doors slammed shut with a finality that made her heart hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. As the vehicle began to move, Toos realized she was being taken into a void where her status, her wealth, and her name no longer offered any protection. The drive lasted for what felt like hours. Toos tried to keep track of the turns, but the blindfold was so tight it made her dizzy. Eventually, the van slowed down and came to a stop. She was led out of the vehicle and into a building where the air smelled of old wood and damp concrete. She heard a heavy door creak open, and then she was pushed onto a small, thin mattress. The door was locked behind her, leaving her alone in a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. In the beginning, the fear was overwhelming. She lay on the mattress with her hands tied, her breath coming in short, jagged gasps. She expected the men to come back at any moment and hurt her, but as the hours turned into days, she realized they had a different plan. They were not interested in her as a person. They were treating her like a high-value piece of inventory. They wanted a ransom, and they wanted it in the form of unrefined gold bars, which were nearly impossible to track. Tooze knew that if she was going to survive, she had to stop being a victim and start being an observer. Even though she could not see, her other senses began to sharpen until they were like surgical instruments. She started by focusing on the room itself. By moving her feet, she realized the floor was made of old, uneven wooden planks. When she stood up and walked, she counted her steps. 5 steps to the wall, 6 steps to the corner. She was building a map in her mind. The most important information, however, came from the world outside her windowless prison. Every morning, she began to listen for the first signs of life. At exactly 7 o'clock, she heard the distant, muffled chime of a church bell. It was not a grand cathedral bell, but a small, rhythmic tolling. She realized that if she could identify the melody or the timing of those bells, she might be able to figure out which village or town she was being held in. A few hours after the bells, she would hear another sound. It was a low industrial hum that lasted for several hours, accompanied by a very faint, sweet smell that drifted through the cracks in the walls. It was the distinct scent of a sugar beet factory processing its harvest. In the Netherlands, these factories are common, but they are located in very specific regions. Toos memorized the intensity of the smell, noting that it grew stronger when the wind blew from the north. In the late afternoon, a new sound would vibrate through the floorboards. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of a train passing nearby. Toos would press her ear against the wooden planks and count the seconds it took for the vibration to fade. Based on the intensity, she estimated the tracks were less than half a mile away. She also noted the exact time the train passed 4:15 every single day. She was not just a captive anymore. She was a surveyor recording a symphony of data. Her captors would visit her only to provide food and water. They never spoke more than a few words, and they always used forced low whispers to hide their identities. But Toos began to study their movements. She noted that one man had a slight limp in his right foot, creating a skip in his step. Another man always smelled faintly of expensive tobacco. She recorded these small physical details as if they were coordinates on a map, waiting for the day she could finally share them. For 3 long weeks, Toos lived in this world of shadows and sounds. Back in the outside world, her husband was engaged in a desperate, high-stakes game of chess with the kidnappers. They demanded millions in gold, and the Dutch police were forced to stay in the shadows to keep Toos alive. Eventually, the deal was struck. The gold was delivered to a remote location, and the kidnappers, believing they had committed the perfect crime, prepared to release their high-value cargo. On a freezing night in late January, Toos was led out of the building and put back into the van. The drive was shorter this time, and when the vehicle finally stopped, she was helped out onto a deserted roadside. One of the men told her to stay still and count to 100 before taking off her blindfold. She heard the van roar away, and for the first time in 21 days, she was alone in the open air. Her fingers were trembling so hard she could barely untie the knot. When the blindfold finally fell away, the world was a blur of gray, moonlight, and shadows. She was standing on a secondary highway, her legs shaking and her vision struggling to adjust. She started walking, and soon a passing motorist saw her and pulled over. Within an hour, she was reunited with her family, but the ordeal was far from over. While she was safe, the men who had taken her were still out there, and they had a fortune in gold bars that could disappear forever. Toos sat down with the investigators from the National Police. They expected her to be traumatized and unable to offer much detail, but she surprised them. She did not talk about her fear. Instead, she talked about the sounds. She told them about the church bells that rang at 7 o'clock. She described the specific sweet smell of the sugar beet factory and how the wind carried it. Most importantly, she gave them the exact schedule of the trains that shook her floorboards. The police were stunned. They took her data and cross-referenced it with industrial maps and railway schedules. By overlaying the location of sugar beet factories with the specific train lines that had a 4:15 afternoon service, they were able to narrow the search area down to a few square miles. Within 48 hours, they had identified a secluded farmhouse that sat within hearing distance of a village church. The symphony Toos had recorded was a perfect set of coordinates. When the tactical teams raided the farmhouse, they found the room exactly as Toos had described it. They found the wooden planks she had counted, the thin mattress, and even the tobacco the man had been smoking. They also found a portion of the gold bars hidden beneath the floorboards. Because of her presence of mind and her ability to turn her sensory deprivation into a weapon, the entire criminal syndicate was dismantled, and the men were brought to justice within days. Toos van der Valk returned to her life, but she was no longer the same woman. She had learned that the world was not as open and safe as she had once believed. However, she had also discovered a strength within herself that she never knew existed. She had survived by listening to the truth of her environment when her eyes were forced shut. The gold was recovered and the motel empire continued to grow, but the family home was never left unlocked again after that rainy January night. The image of those gold bars sitting on the police evidence table became a symbol of a crime that was solved by the most human of tools, the power of observation. But while twos used the air around her to find her way home, mothers in France were discovering that the very air in their nurseries had become a lethal trap. A common household scent was about to turn a daily ritual of love into a medical mystery that would claim the lives of the most innocent victims. At 8 o'clock on a bright sunny Tuesday morning in April of 1972, a 24-year-old mother named Marie was standing in the middle of a sun-drenched nursery in the Brittany region of France. The room was decorated in soft pastels filled with hand-knitted blankets and the quiet, rhythmic sounds of her 3-month-old son Pierre waking up from his morning nap. For Marie, this was the most peaceful time of her day, a moment of pure domestic bliss that felt completely untouchable. Marie was the kind of mother who took immense pride in the small daily rituals of childcare. She lived in a charming stone cottage surrounded by rolling green hills, and her entire world revolved around ensuring Pierre was comfortable, healthy, and safe. As she reached into the wooden crib to lift her son, she breathed in the familiar scent of the room. It was a mixture of fresh linens, warm milk, and the sweet, clean aroma of the baby products she used every single day without fail. In 1972, there was one brand that every French mother trusted above all others. It was called Bébé Morange, and their talcum powder was the gold standard of the industry. It came in a cheerful blue and white tin and was marketed as the purest, most gentle substance you could put on an infant's skin. For generations, it had been a staple in every nursery in the country. To Marie, that blue tin wasn't just a product, it was a symbol of her own diligence as a protective mother. After lifting Pierre from his crib, Marie carried him over to the changing table for his post-nap routine. The baby was unusually calm that morning, his big blue eyes tracking her movements with a sort of sleepy curiosity. Marie smiled at him, cooing softly as she began to change his diaper. She noticed a very tiny, faint red rash developing in the folds of his skin, likely just a bit of irritation from the damp spring air. It was nothing to worry about, she told herself, because she had the cure. She reached for the trusted blue tin of Bebe Morange powder. With a practiced motion, she shook a generous cloud of the fine white dust over Pierre's skin. The powder was soft and cool, and as it settled, the nursery was filled with that signature clean scent that Marie associated with safety and health. She gently patted the powder into his skin, making sure he was completely dry and protected. She felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing she was taking the best possible care of her son. However, as Marie was dressing Pierre in a clean cotton onesie, she noticed a very small, very strange detail. Usually, when she tickled Pierre's feet during a changing, he would kick his legs and let out a tiny, high-pitched giggle. But this morning, when she brushed her fingers against his soles, he didn't move. His legs felt strangely heavy, almost like lead. She looked at his face, and while he was still awake, his eyes seemed to be drifting, focusing on something far away that she couldn't see. Marie paused her hand, hovering over his tiny buttons. She told herself that he was probably just still groggy from his nap. Babies have off days, she reasoned. Perhaps he was just going through a growth spurt and needed more rest. She finished dressing him and carried him into the kitchen to prepare his bottle, but the feeling of unease stayed with her, a cold prickle at the back of her neck that she couldn't quite explain. It was the first tiny crack in the perfect world she had built. By noon, that crack had widened into a chasm of fear. Pierre had refused his bottle entirely, which was completely unlike him. Usually he was a voracious eater, but now he seemed too tired to even latch onto the nipple. He wasn't crying or fussing, he was just slipping into a deep, unnerving lethargy. Marie sat in her rocking chair, cradling him, watching his chest rise and fall. His breathing seemed slower than usual, and his skin felt oddly cool to the touch despite the warmth of the room. Marie decided she couldn't wait any longer. She wrapped Pierre in a heavy wool blanket and drove as fast as she could to the local pediatric clinic. As she walked into the waiting room, she expected to be the only one there with such a strange complaint. But to her shock, the room was crowded with other young mothers, all of them looking just as pale and terrified as she was. Some were pacing back and forth, while others sat in stunned silence, clutching infants who looked exactly like Pierre. The atmosphere in the clinic was thick with a palpable, vibrating tension. Marie overheard a woman next to her telling a nurse that her daughter had suddenly stopped moving her arms and seemed to be in a trance. Another mother was weeping quietly, saying her son had started having strange rhythmic twitches in his sleep. The doctors were moving through the hallways with a sense of frantic urgency Marie had never seen before. It felt as if a silent, invisible shadow had fallen over the entire town. When the pediatrician finally examined Pierre, his face turned grim. He checked the baby's reflexes and shone a light into his eyes, but Pierre barely reacted. The doctor turned to Marie and asked if she had traveled recently or if Pierre had been around any sick children. Marie shook her head, her voice trembling as she explained they hadn't left the cottage in a week. The doctor sighed and told her that Pierre was suffering from acute cerebral edema. His brain was swelling rapidly. Marie felt the blood drain from her face. How could a perfectly healthy 3-month-old baby suddenly develop brain swelling? The doctor explained that they were seeing a wave of similar cases across the region, but they had no idea what was causing it. They suspected a new aggressive strain of meningitis or perhaps an unknown environmental toxin. Pierre was rushed into an ambulance and taken to the large regional hospital in Rennes, where he was placed in a high-tech neonatal intensive care unit. For the next 48 hours, Marie lived in a waking nightmare. She sat in the hospital cafeteria, drinking bitter coffee she couldn't taste, watching as more and more families arrived with sick infants. The mystery was growing. By the second day, 2 babies in the ward had already passed away, and several others had fallen into deep comas. The best medical minds in France were baffled. They tested the water, the milk supply, and even the air quality in the local nurseries, but everything came back clean. In a small, cluttered office on the other side of the city, a relentless forensic toxicologist named Dr. André Helwaji was staring at a map of the outbreaks. He noticed a pattern that the frontline doctors had missed. The cases weren't following a path of infection like a virus would. Instead, they were clustered around specific neighborhoods and shopping districts. He began to suspect that the killer wasn't a living organism, but something mechanical, something domestic that was being used in these homes. Dr. Helwaji began a systematic house-to-house investigation of the victims' families. He was a man who believed that the truth was always hidden in the mundane details of everyday life. He spent hours in nurseries, sniffing wallpaper, testing laundry detergents, and checking the paint on cribs. He arrived at the hospital where Marie was staying and asked to speak with her. He didn't ask about Pierre's symptoms. Instead, he asked her to walk him through every single thing she did during her morning routine. Marie, exhausted and tearful, described the bath, the feeding, and the changing. When she mentioned the Bebe Morhange talcum powder, Dr. Helwaji paused. He asked to see the tin she had brought in her diaper bag. He took the blue and white container and held it up to the light. It looked perfectly innocent, the same product he had seen in his own home when his children were small. He opened the lid and took a small sniff. It smelled like the very essence of a clean, safe nursery. He took a sample of the powder back to his laboratory. As he ran the initial tests, he expected to find nothing. But as the results began to flicker across his equipment, his heart nearly stopped. The powder wasn't just talcum. It was contaminated with a massive 6% concentration of a powerful disinfectant called hexachlorophene. This chemical was a potent germ killer used in hospitals, but in high doses, it was a devastating neurotoxin that could be absorbed directly through an infant's porous skin. The discovery sent a shockwave through the French Ministry of Public Health. They realized that for weeks, thousands of mothers across the country had been unknowingly applying a lethal chemical directly onto their children's bodies. The very thing they were using to treat minor rashes and keep their babies comfortable was actually the weapon that was shutting down their nervous systems. The scent of safety had become a signature of death delivered by the hands of the people who loved the victims most. The investigation moved with lightning speed to the Bebe Morhange manufacturing plant. What they found there was a chilling example of how a single mundane error can lead to a mass casualty event. During a routine cleaning of the large industrial mixing vats, a worker had accidentally left a significant amount of concentrated hexachlorophene in the bottom of a container. When the next batch of talcum powder was poured in, the chemical was blended into the mixture, creating a lethal, invisible poison. Because the powder looked, felt, and smelled exactly the same as the safe version, there was no way for the quality control team or the consumers to know anything was wrong. The contaminated batch, consisting of thousands of tins, was shipped out to pharmacies and grocery stores across northern France. It sat on the shelves waiting for mothers like Marie to pick it up and bring it into their homes. It was a silent executioner disguised as a household staple, weaponized by a simple failure of factory protocol. The government issued an emergency nationwide recall broadcasting warnings on every television and radio station. Police officers were sent door to door in Brittany, telling parents to immediately stop using the blue tins and to wash their babies with plain water. But for many, the warning came too late. By the time the recall was complete, 36 infants had lost their lives, and hundreds of others, including little Pierre, were facing a long and uncertain road to recovery from the neurological damage. Marie sat by Pierre's bedside as the toxins slowly cleared from his system. It would take months of physical therapy before he could move his legs properly again, and the doctors couldn't say for sure if there would be long-term cognitive effects. Marie felt a crushing weight of guilt that she couldn't shake. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw herself shaking that white powder onto his skin, believing she was doing the right thing. The memory of that clean smell now made her feel physically ill. The aftermath of the poison talcum scandal changed the world of consumer safety forever. It led to the creation of the first strict modern regulations for cosmetics and baby products across the European Union. Manufacturers were forced to implement rigorous testing for every single batch of product before it left the warehouse. The era of blind trust in big brands was over-replaced by a system of checks and balances designed to ensure that a nursery would never again become a place of chemical warfare. Marie and Pierre eventually returned to their stone cottage in the hills. The nursery was still there, but the soft pastels and hand-knitted blankets now felt different to Marie. She had removed every single commercial product from the room, replaced by simple, natural alternatives. She no longer trusted the gold standards or the cheerful logos. She had learned the hardest way possible that danger doesn't always come from the outside. Sometimes it's already sitting on your shelf looking perfectly ordinary. Today, the Bebe Morhanji case is still studied in medical and legal schools as a definitive example of industrial negligence and the importance of forensic toxicology. It serves as a haunting reminder that the most dangerous things in our lives are often the ones we are most familiar with. The innocent blue tin, once a symbol of maternal care, remains a ghostly artifact of a time when a simple factory cleaning error turned a nation's nurseries into scenes of a silent, heart-wrenching tragedy. The image of that nursery in Brittany, once so full of peace and now forever marked by a hidden poison, is a reminder that our routines are only as safe as the systems behind them. But while a household object betrayed a mother's trust in France, a different kind of betrayal was unfolding in the political heart of East Africa. In the lush green canopy of the Ngong forest, a popular hero was about to discover that the people he trusted to lead his nation were the ones who had already signed his death warrant. At 7 o'clock in the evening on March 2nd, 1975, the lobby of the Hilton Hotel in Nairobi, Kenya was a whirlwind of activity and elegance. The air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco, imported perfumes, and the soft clinking of ice in crystal glasses. This was the beating heart of a young nation trying to define its future, a place where business tycoons and high-ranking officials gathered to negotiate the fate of the country over cocktails and low-toned conversations. Standing in the center of this world was a man who didn't just walk into a room, he owned the atmosphere within it. Josiah Mwangi Kariuki, known to everyone simply as JM, was a 46-year-old politician with a smile that could melt the most cynical of hearts. He was dressed in a sharp, custom-tailored suit that fit his lean frame perfectly, his eyes dancing with intelligence as he shook hands and joked with the crowd of admirers that always seemed to follow him. To the wealthy elites in the Hilton JM was a peer, a man who moved comfortably in their circles. But to the millions of Kenyans living in the sprawling shanty towns and rural villages, he was something far more significant. He was their voice. J.M. was famous for a single stinging sentence that he repeated at every rally: Kenya has become a nation of 10 millionaires and 10 million beggars. It was a dangerous thing to say in a country ruled by a small, powerful inner circle. But on this particular Sunday evening, JM didn't look like a man who was worried about his safety. He felt protected by his immense popularity. He was a hero, a populist icon who believed that his connection to the people was an invisible shield. As he stood near the elevators, he caught the eye of a man he recognized. It was a high-ranking police official, someone JM had known for years. The man leaned in and whispered something into JM. There's ear nodding toward the door. JM checked his gold wristwatch, a small gesture that seemed entirely ordinary. He smiled at his friends and told them he had a quick meeting to attend, but would be back in an hour to finish their conversation. He walked toward the glass revolving doors, his footsteps echoing on the polished marble floor. Outside, a long black government limousine was idling at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the city lights. J.M. stepped inside, the door closed with a muffled thud, and the car pulled away. The hour passed, then 2, then 3. The group of friends at the Hilton eventually finished their drinks and went home, assuming JM had simply gotten caught up in another long political discussion. He was a busy man after all. But back at his own house, his wife and children were beginning to feel the first sharp pricks of unease. JM was a man of his word, and he never stayed out late without calling to let them know he was safe. The house was too quiet. By the next morning, the unease had turned into a full-blown panic. JM had not returned, and his private office was empty. His colleagues began making frantic phone calls to police stations and hospitals, but they were met with a wall of polite confusion. No one seemed to know where he was. The government, however, had a very quick and very specific answer. They released a short statement saying that J.M. Kariuki had flown to Zambia on an urgent private business trip. For a few days, the people of Kenya tried to believe the official story. They told themselves that their hero was just away on a secret mission to help the poor. But the logic began to fall apart almost immediately. His passport was still at his house. None of the airlines had a record of him boarding a flight. The tension in the streets of Nairobi began to vibrate like a guitar string stretched too tight. People started to whisper that the government was lying to them. While the city was gripped by rumors and student riots, 60 miles away in the remote and rugged landscape of the Ngong Forest, a group of Maasai herders were moving their cattle through the thick brush. The air in the forest was cool and damp, filled with the sounds of birds and the rustle of leaves. It was a place of ancient beauty far removed from the political maneuvering of the capital. But as the herders reached a small clearing, they noticed something that made them stop. High above the canopy, dozens of vultures were circling in the bright blue sky. They weren't just passing through, they were spiraling down toward a specific spot near a dry riverbed. The herders followed the birds, pushing through the dense undergrowth until they reached the edge of the ravine. There, lying among the rocks and the red dust, was the body of a man. He was wearing the remnants of an expensive suit, but the person inside that suit had been treated with unimaginable cruelty. The herders didn't recognize the man, but they knew they were looking at a professional execution. The body had been doused in a powerful acid that had eaten away much of the skin and the facial features. The fingers had been deliberately crushed, and most of the teeth had been hammered out of the jaw. It was a calculated attempt to erase the identity of the victim, to turn a human being into a nameless piece of evidence that the forest would eventually swallow whole. The police were called, and the body was brought to the city mortuary as an unidentified male. The government officials continued to insist that J.M. was in Zambia even as the news of the discovery in the Ngong forest began to leak out. They calculated that without a positive identification, the mystery would eventually fade away, but they had underestimated the courage of one man, a local dentist named Dr. Ribeiro, who had treated J.M. Kariuki for many years. Dr. Ribeiro went to the mortuary, defying the armed guards standing at the door. He asked to examine the jaw of the unidentified man. He knew that J.M. had a very specific natural gap between his lower front teeth, a detail that was documented in his dental records. As the doctor peeled back the damaged tissue, his hands began to shake. Despite the acid and the attempts to destroy the teeth, that unmistakable gap was still there. He looked up and whispered the name of the victim. The news that J.M. Karayuki's body had been found in the forest hit Kenya like a physical blow. The 10 million beggars he had spoken for rose up in a wave of grief and fury that threatened to burn the country down. The government was forced to form a parliamentary select committee to investigate the murder. It was a high-stakes drama played out in the halls of power as courageous investigators began to track the movements of that black limousine on the night of March 2nd. What they found was a trail that led directly into the heart of the president's inner circle. They discovered that the man who had whispered to JM at the Hilton was a top commander of the elite General Service Unit. They found witnesses who had seen JM being led into a private interrogation room at a police station before being driven to the forest. It wasn't a random crime, it was a state-sanctioned execution of a man who was becoming more powerful than the government itself. The investigation uncovered the final moments of the hero's life. J.M. had been tortured for hours, but he had refused to beg for his life. He had died in the silence of the Ngong forest, a place where the trees stood as silent witnesses to a betrayal of the very people he had tried to save. The committee's report was a devastating indictment of the regime, naming high-ranking officials and suggesting that the order had come from the very top of the political mountain. However, in the end, justice remained as elusive as the shadows in the woods. The government suppressed parts of the report, and the primary suspects were never brought to trial. The men who had hammered out J.M. On's teeth and poured acid over his face remained in power, walking the same halls of the Hilton where they had once shared drinks with their victim. The nation was left with a heavy, bitter silence that would linger for decades, a reminder of the price of truth. J.M. Karayuki was buried in a ceremony attended by hundreds of thousands of people. They didn't come to hear speeches, they came to stand in the quiet and honor a man who had seen their suffering and spoken it out loud. His death transformed him from a politician into a martyr, a permanent ghost that haunted the conscience of the ruling elite. The Ngong Forest, once just a scenic backdrop for the capital, became a place of somber pilgrimage for those who remembered his name. The image of that empty chair on a stage in Nairobi with a sea of silent mourners staring at it is the final legacy of a man who tried to bridge the gap between the millionaires and the beggars. He was silenced by the very state he helped build, leaving behind a nation that had to learn how to find its voice again in the wake of his absence. The silence of the forest was not the end of his story, but the beginning of a legend that refused to die. The quiet of the Ngong forest was a heavy political weight that changed the history of a continent, but across the world, a different kind of silence was being prepared. In the alpine valleys of Austria, a poet was waiting in the darkness, ready to turn a scenic trail into a place of ritual. At 8:45 on the morning of February 1st, 1974, a 20-year-old bank clerk named Claudio was leaning against a mahogany desk on the 19th floor of the Joelma building in São Paulo, Brazil. To Claudio, this place was more than just an office, it was a cathedral of glass and steel. He took immense pride in his morning routine, which always began with a perfectly timed cup of strong Brazilian coffee and the quiet hum of the air conditioning system. The Joelma building was a shimmering marvel of modern architecture, a brand new 25-story giant that stood as a symbol of Brazil's incredible economic boom. From his window on the 19th floor, Claudio could look out over the sprawling, humid landscape of São Paulo, watching the city pulse with a new, frantic energy. The skyscraper felt like the safest place on Earth, a high-tech fortress of concrete that surely nothing in the world could ever hope to penetrate. Inside the bank's offices, the atmosphere was busy but peaceful. The sounds of heavy manual typewriters clacking away and the polite chatter of clerks filled the room. Claudio was focused on a stack of ledgers, his pen moving rhythmically across the paper. The morning sun streamed through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, heating the office just enough that the cool breeze from the vents felt like a luxury. It was a Tuesday like any other, defined by predictable, comfortable work. However, just as Claudio was finishing his first ledger, the lights overhead did something strange. They didn't flicker or go out, they simply dipped in intensity for a fraction of a second, casting a momentary shadow across his desk. He paused his pen, hovering over a column of numbers, and looked up at the ceiling. A few of his coworkers noticed it too, but they all shared a collective shrug. In a brand new building, you expect a few technical hiccups during the first year of operation. Claudio went back to his work, but about 5 minutes later, he heard a new sound. It was a soft, high-pitched hiss coming from the air conditioning vents, almost like a steam pipe had developed a tiny leak. He stood up and walked toward the wall, placing his hand near the metal grating. Instead of the refreshing, cool air he expected, he felt a faint, warm draft. It wasn't hot, just slightly above room temperature, but it carried a very specific and very unsettling scent. It was a sweet, synthetic smell, almost like a piece of plastic had been left too close to a light bulb. Claudio sniffed the air again, his brow furrowed in confusion. He looked around the office, but no one else seemed to notice the smell yet. He told himself it was probably just the new insulation heating up in the sun, or perhaps some maintenance work being done on a lower floor. Skyscrapers are complex machines, he reasoned, and they make all sorts of strange noises and smells. 10 minutes later, the sweet smell had transformed into something much sharper and more aggressive. It now smelled like a chemical fire, thick and acrid, and it began to sting the back of Claudio's throat. He noticed a faint gray haze beginning to gather near the ceiling tiles. Suddenly, a colleague who was sitting near the window let out a sharp cry and pointed downward. Claudio rushed to the glass and looked toward the street below, but his heart stopped before he even reached it. Below them, on the 12th floor, thick tongues of orange flame were licking out from around the window frames. Great plumes of black smoke were being carried upward by the wind, wrapping around the side of the building like a dark shroud. The peaceful Tuesday morning had vanished in an instant. Within seconds, the office was filled with the sound of shouting as people realized that the fire wasn't just in the building, it was directly beneath them and it was moving with incredible speed. The realization of danger hit the office like a physical shock. Claudio felt a sudden cold wave of adrenaline wash over him, making his fingers feel numb and his legs heavy. He moved toward the elevator bank, joining a crowd of panicked coworkers who were frantically pressing the call buttons, but the small glowing lights remained dark. The power to the elevators had been cut, leaving the shimmering glass cars trapped in their shafts somewhere deep in the gut of the burning building. The crowd surged toward the central stairwell, the only other way out. Claudio reached the heavy fire door and pulled it open, but he was immediately forced back by a wall of heat so intense it felt like he had opened the door to an oven. The stairwell, which was supposed to be a path to safety, had turned into a chimney. The fire on the lower floors was feeding on the oxygen in the shaft, drawing thick, toxic clouds of carbon monoxide upward at a terrifying velocity. Claudio slammed the door shut, his lungs burning from just a single breath of the black smoke. He looked at the faces of his coworkers and saw a reflection of his own terror. They were trapped on the 19th floor, sandwiched between a rising wall of fire and a roof they weren't sure they could reach. The building that had felt like a fortress just an hour ago now felt like a vertical blast furnace. The beautiful glass windows were now a barrier trapping the heat inside. As the temperature in the office began to climb, the survival instinct took over. Claudio shouted for everyone to follow him upward toward the roof. He figured that if they couldn't go down, they had to go as high as they could, hoping for a rescue from above. They scrambled up the secondary maintenance stairs, their shoes slipping on the smooth concrete as they climbed past the 20th, 21st, and 22nd floors. Every step was a battle against the thickening smoke. By the time Claudio reached the roof, his clothes were soaked with sweat and his face was smeared with soot. He burst out into the open air and gasped his lungs greedily, pulling in the humid Sao Paulo breeze. But he wasn't alone. Over 500 people had already gathered on the rooftop, crowded together on the flat concrete surface. They were all looking up at the sky with a desperate, heartbreaking hope, waiting for the sound of helicopters that surely were on their way. Below them, the Joelma building was being consumed. The fire was feeding on highly flammable synthetic carpets, wooden partitions, and plastic acoustic tiles that had been used throughout the interior. Because the building had no sprinklers and no internal fire doors, there was nothing to stop the flames from jumping from floor to floor. From the roof, Claudio could hear the terrifying sound of the glass windows below shattering from the heat, sounding like a constant barrage of gunfire. The first helicopter appeared about 20 minutes later, a small police bird that circled the roof. The crowd let out a collective cheer, waving their arms and shouting, convinced that their rescue had arrived. But as the pilot hovered over the roof, something went wrong. The helicopter began to wobble violently, its tail dipping as if it were being shoved by an invisible hand. The pilot struggled for control, eventually veering away and gaining altitude, leaving the roof behind. Claudio watched in horror as two more helicopters approached and were forced to retreat in the same way. He didn't understand it then, but the fire was so massive that it had created its own weather system. A powerful thermal updraft of superheated air was screaming upward from the burning floors, creating a violent vortex above the rooftop. The air was too thin and too turbulent for any helicopter to land or even hover close enough to drop a rescue line. The hope on the roof began to rot into a dark, suffocating despair. The concrete beneath Claudio's feet was becoming hot to the touch as the fire reached the floors directly below the roofline. People began to realize that no help was coming from the sky, and there was nowhere else to go. The smoke was now thick even on the rooftop, a black wall that blocked out the sun and made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. In those final, desperate moments, Claudio witnessed the true horror of the Joelma fire. At the edges of the roof, people were staring down at the street 25 stories below. They were being pressed forward by the advancing heat and the billowing clouds of toxic smoke. To Claudio's left, he saw a man in a business suit climb onto the low concrete parapet. The man didn't look back. He simply leaned forward and vanished into the gray haze, choosing a quick fall over the fire. This was the beginning of the flying leaps. On live television, millions of people across Brazil watched in stunned silence as person after person made the impossible choice. Some jumped alone, while others held hands, their silhouettes falling like dark leaves against the backdrop of the orange flames. Claudio stood in the center of the roof, his eyes closed, his hand pressed his mouth to keep from screaming. He felt the heat through his shoes, a searing, white-hot pain. He found a small concrete shed near the center of the roof, a housing for the elevator machinery. He crawled inside with a few others, pressing his face against the cold floor and wrapping his head in his damp suit jacket. He didn't think he would survive. He was just trying to hide from the choices being made at the edge of the roof. He listened to the roar of the fire and the distant, haunting thuds of the people hitting the pavement below, a sound that he would never forget. Hours passed in a blur of heat and near unconsciousness. Claudio felt like he was floating in a dark, boiling sea, his mind drifting away from the horror of the rooftop. But then he felt a new sensation. It was a fine mist of water falling on his back. He opened his eyes and saw a firefighter standing over him wearing a heavy silver suit that looked like an astronaut's uniform. The fire had finally been brought under control, and the rescue teams had fought their way up the stairs. When Claudio was finally led down from the roof, he didn't recognize the building he had worked in. The shimmering cathedral of glass was now a blackened skeletal ruin. The mahogany desks, the ledgers, and the mahogany partitions had been reduced to a fine layer of gray ash. As he stepped out onto the sidewalk, he saw the true scale of the tragedy. 188 people had lost their lives, and the pavement was littered with the remnants of the people who had jumped. Claudio walked away from the Joelma building that afternoon, his body trembling so hard he could barely stay upright. He passed a small polished leather shoe, sitting alone on the sidewalk nearly a block away from the building. It was perfectly intact, sitting there, as if someone had just stepped out of it for a moment. That image, the mundane object sitting in the wake of such a massive catastrophe, stayed with him for the rest of his life, a silent witness to the choices made on the roof. The Juelma fire resulted in a complete overhaul of structural fire safety laws across the globe. It exposed the total lack of protection in the new generation of skyscrapers and led to mandatory sprinklers, fire doors, and pressurized stairwells in every high-rise building. The architectural world learned that a building of glass and steel is only as safe as its ability to protect the people inside from the very air they breathe. The skyscraper was no longer a fortress, it was a responsibility. Claudio never returned to banking. The sound of a coffee cup vibrating on a desk or the hiss of an air conditioner was enough to send him into a state of paralyzed fear. He moved to a small house in the countryside, a place where he could always see the ground and where the only things that flew over his head were birds. The memory of the flying leaps remained a dark, heavy weight in his soul, a reminder of the day the modern world turned into a vertical furnace. The image of that single shoe on the sidewalk is a haunting afterimage of a tragedy born from a lack of foresight, a small detail that speaks to the massive loss of life in the heart of Sao Paulo. But while the fire in Brazil was a tragedy of engineering and structural failure, a different kind of ambush was being prepared on the busy streets of Monterrey, Mexico. On a quiet morning commute, an iconic industrialist was about to discover that his pride was the only thing protecting him from a waiting trap. At 7:30 on a Monday morning in September of 1973, the city of Monterrey, Mexico, was already beginning to shimmer under a blanket of dry desert heat. The massive, jagged peak of the Cerro de la Silla mountain loomed over the valley like a silent guardian, its purple shadows slowly retreating as the sun climbed higher into the sky. For most people, it was just the start of another long work week in the industrial heart of the country. Inside a quiet, high-walled estate in one of the city's most affluent neighborhoods, an 81-year-old man named Eugenio Garza Sada was finishing his morning coffee. Eugenio was not just a wealthy man, he was a titan of industry whose influence reached into every corner of Mexican life. He had built universities, funded hospitals, and created thousands of jobs. To the people of Monterrey, he was a living legend, a man of iron discipline and immense personal pride. Despite his wealth and the growing political unrest that was beginning to bubble beneath the surface of the country, Eugenio was a man of simple, rigid habits. He didn't like the fuss of modern celebrity or the heavy hand of security. He woke up at the same time every day, ate the same breakfast, and left for his office at the same hour. He believed that a man who lived with integrity and worked for the common good had no reason to fear his own neighbors or his city. As he walked out to the driveway, he waved off the idea of a heavy security detail, something his advisors had been begging him to consider for months. He felt that surrounding himself with armed guards would be a betrayal of the trust he had built with the people. Instead, he climbed into the back of his 1970 Ford Galaxy, a heavy, dark sedan that was as solid and reliable as the man who sat inside it. He felt perfectly safe within the familiar confines of his car. Behind the wheel was his longtime chauffeur and personal assistant, Bernardo Chapa. Bernardo was more than just an employee. He was a loyal companion who understood the rhythm of Eugenio's life perfectly. They shared a comfortable, respectful silence as the car pulled out of the gates and began its daily crawl through the narrow, winding streets of the neighborhood, heading toward the industrial district, where the massive steel and brewery factories were already humaning. Inside the car, the upholstery smelled of old leather and the faint scent of the expensive soap Eugenio had used that morning. He was looking over a set of reports for the Monterrey Institute of Technology, making small, neat notes in the margins with a silver fountain pen. He took great satisfaction in these quiet moments of reflection before the chaos of the office began. To him, the hum of the city was the sound of a machine he had helped build and maintain for decades. The drive was a familiar sequence of turns and landmarks. They passed the same street vendors setting up their colorful stalls and the same groups of students walking toward the university Eugenio had helped found. For the first 15 minutes, everything was perfectly normal. The air inside the car was cool, the engine of the Ford Galaxy purring with a low, reassuring thrum as they navigated the morning traffic with a practiced ease that only comes from years of repetition. As they approached a busy urban intersection near the Cuauhtémoc Brewery, Eugenio noticed a small yellow pickup truck parked awkwardly at the curb. It wasn't blocking the road entirely, but it was positioned in a way that forced passing cars to slow down and veer slightly to the left. It was a minor inconvenience, the kind of thing you see every day in a growing city, but for some reason, the sight of it made Bernardo tighten his grip on the steering wheel until his knuckles were white. Bernardo slowed the sedan to a crawl, waiting for a gap in the oncoming traffic. As the Ford Galaxy pulled alongside the yellow truck, a second vehicle, a dark, nondescript sedan, suddenly swerved out from a side street and slammed its brakes, cutting off their path completely. Bernardo reacted instantly, slamming on his own brakes. The heavy car lurched to a halt, the tires screeching against the hot asphalt as the peaceful morning air was shattered by the smell of burnt rubber. Eugenio looked up from his papers, his heart beginning to race. Through the windshield, he saw four young men jumping out of the dark sedan. They weren't wearing masks, but they were dressed in heavy denim jackets despite the rising heat. They weren't moving like common criminals. They moved with a frantic ideological energy. One of them was carrying a long canvas bag, and as he reached into it, Eugenio saw the cold gray glint of a submachine gun pointed at them. These men were members of the 23rd of September Communist League, a radical urban guerrilla group that viewed men like Eugenio as symbols of everything they hated. Their plan wasn't to kill him, they wanted a political prize. They intended to kidnap the 81-year-old industrialist and hold him for a ransom of $5 million. But they had completely underestimated the stubborn bravery of the man and the loyalty of the driver they were targeting. Bernardo Chapa did not wait for the gunmen to reach the doors. He knew exactly what was happening the moment he saw the weapons. Reaching into the glove compartment, he pulled out a small caliber pistol and fired a shot through the side window, shouting for Eugenio to get down on the floor. The sound of the glass shattering was the signal for the intersection to turn into a war zone. The gunmen, surprised by the resistance, began to fire wildly at the dark sedan. The heavy metal body of the Ford Galaxy became a drum as dozens of bullets slammed into the doors and the hood. Eugenio huddled on the floorboards, the smell of gunpowder and burnt rubber filling the cabin. He could hear the shouts of the radicals and the terrifying rhythmic thud of the submachine gun as it sprayed the windshield with lead. Bernardo continued to fire back his face, a mask of grim determination, as he tried to protect the man he had served for 20 years. The intensity of the noise inside the car was something Eugenio could never have prepared for. Every time a bullet punched through the thin sheet metal of the doors, it made a sound like a heavy hammer hitting an anvil. Fragments of glass and stuffing from the seats flew through the air, creating a swirling blizzard of debris that made it hard to see or breathe. Bernardo was shouting something, but the roar of the gunfire made it impossible to understand a single word. In the chaos of the close-quarters gun battle, the line between a kidnapping and an execution began to blur. One of the gunmen lunged for the rear door, pulling it open with a violent jerk. He tried to grab Eugenio, but the old man, despite his age, fought back with everything he had. He grabbed the kidnapper's arm, struggling with a strength born of pure survival. For a few frantic seconds, the most powerful man in Monterrey was wrestling for his life in the back seat. A second gunman, seeing the struggle, leaned into the car and fired a burst toward the floorboards. The noise inside the enclosed space was deafening, a physical force that seemed to shake the very air. Eugenio felt a sharp, burning heat in his chest, a sensation so sudden and intense that it stole the breath from his lungs. He slumped back against the seat, his hands finally losing their grip on the attacker as the world began to turn a hazy, shimmering shade of gray. Bernardo Chapa was hit multiple times as he tried to reload his weapon. He fell across the steering wheel, the car's horn beginning to let out a long, mournful blare that echoed through the streets, drowning out the shouts of the radicals. The gunmen, realizing that their prize was dead and the sound of sirens was getting closer, piled back into their vehicles and roared away, leaving behind a scene of absolute devastation in the middle of a quiet, sun-baked avenue. For several minutes after the vehicles roared away, the intersection remained eerily quiet, save for the hiss of the Ford Galaxie's punctured radiator and the rhythmic ticking of the cooling engine. A few brave witnesses began to emerge from the doorways of nearby shops, their faces pale with shock as they looked at the mangled car sitting in the middle of the road. The morning sun continued to beat down on the pavement, indifferent to the tragedy that had just occurred. When the police and ambulances finally arrived, they found the Ford Galaxie riddled with over 60 bullet holes. The intersection, which just minutes ago had been a normal part of the morning commute, was now littered with shell casings and broken glass. Eugenio Garzasada was rushed to the hospital, but the damage to his 81-year-old body was too great. The man who had shaped the face of modern Mexico had died in a street battle he never should have been part of. The news of his death hit Mexico like a physical explosion. Eugenio was a symbol of the country's progress, and his murder was seen as an assault on the very foundation of society. The government's response was swift and brutal. The death of Garza Sada became the catalyst for the Dirty War, a period of intense state repression where the military and secret police used any means necessary to hunt down and disappear radical groups across the country for years to come. In the days that followed, tens of thousands of people lined the streets of Monterrey for Eugenio's funeral. The factories were silent, the shops were closed, and the entire city seemed to be holding its breath in a state of collective mourning. There was a sense that an era had ended, that the old way of living, built on trust and personal pride, had been replaced by a new reality. The father of Monterrey was gone, and he had taken the city's innocence with him. The investigation eventually led to the arrest of several members of the Communist League, but the scars on the national psyche would never truly heal. Mexico's business elite, who had once walked freely among the people, began to withdraw behind high walls and armored glass. The era of private armies and armored SUVs that defines modern corporate life in Mexico began at that bloody intersection in 1973, born from the smoke of a destroyed Ford Galaxie. The Ford Galaxie itself was eventually preserved a silent monument to a day that changed everything. Its dark paint was scarred and chipped, and its interior was stained with the evidence of a struggle that lasted only seconds but felt like a lifetime. For those who saw it, the car wasn't just a piece of machinery anymore. It was a physical manifestation of the moment a national hero was brought down by the very forces of progress and social unrest he had tried to navigate. Today, the intersection near the brewery looks like any other busy street in a modern metropolis. But if you look closely at some of the older buildings nearby, you can still find the faint pockmarks left by stray bullets. They are the only physical reminders of the morning the world turned on Eugenio Garza Sada. The man who refused to live in fear had met his end at the hands of it, leaving behind a legacy that is still whispered about in the long shadow of the mountain. The shattered windshield of that Ford Galaxie, with its spiderweb of cracks centered around a single fatal bullet hole, remains one of the most haunting images in Mexican history. It is a reminder that no amount of power or goodwill can protect you when the world decides to change the rules of the game in the middle of a Monday morning drive. The silence that followed the gunfire in Monterrey was a sign that a new, darker chapter of history was just beginning. The smoke from the ambush in Mexico eventually drifted away, but it was nothing compared to the thick black clouds that were about to rise over a crowded country rock lounge in Montreal. In a place where music and laughter should have been the only sounds, a petty argument was about to turn a Friday night celebration into a frantic struggle for air. The fire in Canada wouldn't be born from a political revolution, but from a simple, deadly act of revenge in the dark. At exactly 9 o'clock on a Friday night in September of 1972, a 21-year-old student named Mark was walking down Union Avenue in the heart of downtown Montreal. The air was crisp, carrying the first hint of autumn, and the city was alive with the sound of traffic and distant laughter. Mark was heading to the Wagon Wheel, a popular lounge located right above the Bluebird Cafe, to meet his best friends for a long-awaited celebration. To Mark and the hundreds of regulars who frequented the Wagon Wheel, this place was more than just a bar. It was a refuge. The lounge was famous for its country rock bands and an atmosphere that felt like a giant extended family reunion. As Mark climbed the narrow wooden staircase that led from the street up to the second floor, he could already hear the rhythmic thrum of the bass and the soulful twang of an electric guitar echoing through the floorboards. The moment he stepped through the door at the top of the stairs, the cool night air was replaced by a wave of warmth and the smell of beer, popcorn, and wood smoke from the old building's character. The room was packed with nearly 200 people, most of them in their early 20s, dancing and shouting over the music. It was the kind of place where everyone felt safe because everyone was a friend of a friend. The lights were low cast in shades of amber and red. Mark found his friends at a corner table near the small stage. They handed him a cold glass, and for the next hour, the world outside Union Avenue ceased to exist. They talked about their classes, their summer jobs, and their plans for the future. The band was playing a cover of a popular Creedence Clearwater song, and the energy in the room was electric. It was a perfect Friday night, the kind of memory you think you will keep forever as a highlight of your youth. However, around 10:15, a small disturbance occurred near the top of the stairs. Mark noticed it only because he was facing the entrance. Three men who looked to be in their late 20s and already heavily intoxicated were trying to push their way past the bouncer. They were being loud and aggressive, stumbling into people and causing a scene. The bouncer, a large man who took his job very seriously, wasn't having any of it. He grabbed the lead man by the collar. A brief, heated argument broke out. Mark watched as the bouncer shoved the three men back toward the staircase. One of the intruders, a man with a jagged scar on his cheek, pointed a finger at the bouncer's chest and shouted something that was drowned out by the music. But his face told the story. It was twisted in a mask of pure, humiliated rage. The bouncer simply turned his back on them and locked the heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs to keep them out. Mark felt a brief flicker of unease, a strange tightening in his chest as he watched the locked door. He told himself it was just a typical bar scuffle. Men get drunk, they get kicked out, and they go find another place to drink. It happened every weekend. He turned back to his friends and took a sip of his drink, trying to force his heart rate to slow down. The band started a new upbeat song, and the crowd surged toward the dance floor, effectively burying the incident. For about 15 minutes, everything returned to normal. The laughter continued, and the floorboards vibrated under the weight of 100 dancing feet. But then, Mark noticed a strange smell. It wasn't the usual scent of the lounge. It was sharp, chemical, and incredibly familiar. It smelled like the lawnmower his father kept in the garage back home. It was the distinct, unmistakable scent of raw gasoline. It was wafting in through the cracks in the wooden floor. Mark leaned over to his friend and asked if he smelled it too. His friend sniffed, the air looked confused for a second, and then shrugged. He suggested that maybe a delivery truck on the street below was idling, or that someone had spilled a cleaning solvent in the cafe downstairs. It was a logical explanation, and Mark wanted to believe it. He sat back in his chair, but his eyes kept drifting toward the floor. He noticed a faint gray wisp of smoke curling up between the boards. Before he could even point it out, the music stopped. It didn't fade out. The power to the stage simply cut off, leaving the room in a sudden, jarring silence. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the chatter of the crowd. Then a muffled, hollow thump echoed from the stairwell, followed by a sound like a giant sheet of paper being torn in half. It was the sound of a flash fire. Suddenly, the amber light of the lounge was replaced by a bright, flickering orange glow. The heavy wooden door that the bouncer had locked just minutes ago was now a wall of flame. The fire didn't crawl into the room, it exploded. The three men had returned with a plastic jug of gasoline, poured it through the mail slot into the wooden stairwell, and struck a match. Because the stairs were made of old dry timber, they turned into a vertical furnace instantly. The only main exit from the second floor lounge was now a pillar of roaring, black-choked heat. The transition from a party to a death trap took less than 30 seconds. The room, filled with thick, oily smoke that tasted like burning plastic and chemicals, panic raw and primal, gripped the crowd. People began to scream, pushing toward the back of the room as the heat from the stairwell became unbearable. Mark grabbed his friend's arm, his vision blurring as the smoke began to sting his eyes. He knew they had to find another way out, and they had to find it now. They fought their way through the throng toward the rear of the building, where an emergency exit door was located. A group of men were already there, throwing their shoulders against the heavy metal door, but it wouldn't budge. Mark watched in horror as he realized why. To prevent people from sneaking into the club without paying the cover charge, the management had placed a heavy iron padlock on the outside of the door. The only secondary exit was literally chained shut. The temperature in the room was rising so fast that Mark felt his skin beginning to blister. The smoke was now so thick that he had to drop to his hands and knees to find a pocket of air. He could hear the sound of people clawing at the walls and the desperate, frantic thuds of bodies hitting the floor as they succumbed to the carbon monoxide. In the chaos, he lost sight of his friends. He was alone in a dark, burning box, and the air was disappearing with every breath. He crawled toward the small bathroom at the far end of the lounge. He remembered it had a tiny window that looked out over the alleyway. When he reached the bathroom, he found 5 other people already there, huddled on the floor. One man was desperately trying to kick out the window, but as the glass shattered, they discovered yet another obstacle. The window was covered by thick, decorative iron bars that were bolted into the brickwork of the building. They were trapped. Mark looked through the bars and could see the lights of the city and the people on the sidewalk below, completely unaware of the horror unfolding just 20 feet above their heads. He screamed for help, but his voice was a ragged whisper. The heat was now so intense that the plastic fixtures in the bathroom were melting, dripping like black wax onto the floor. He pressed his face against the cold iron bars, trying to catch a single breath of fresh air. Outside on the street, the 3 men who had started the fire were standing in the shadows of an alley, watching as the smoke began to pour out of the second-story windows. They hadn't expected the fire to grow so fast or for the exits to be blocked. They watched for a few moments, the reality of what they had done finally beginning to penetrate their drunken haze, and then they turned and ran into the darkness. They left 37 people behind to face the furnace. Back in the bathroom, Mark felt a sudden heavy pressure on his chest. His heart was racing so fast, it felt like it was going to burst, and his fingers were numb. He closed his eyes, thinking of his parents and the celebration they were supposed to have. But then he heard a new sound. It was the sharp metallic clack of a ladder hitting the brickwork outside. A second later, the iron bars over the window were jerked violently outward by a heavy chain attached to a truck. Firefighters had arrived, and they were using a tow truck from a nearby garage to rip the bars off the building. Mark felt a rush of cold air as the window was cleared. He didn't wait. He scrambled up and threw himself through the opening, falling onto the roof of a lower building. He lay there for a long time, gasping and coughing up black soot as the firefighters began to pull other survivors from the hole. He was one of the lucky ones. He had made it out by inches. The Bluebird Cafe fire remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of Montreal. 37 young people lost their lives that night, most of them found piled up against the padlocked emergency exit. The 3 men responsible were eventually caught and sentenced to life in prison, but the true legacy of the tragedy was the change it forced upon the world. This event led to the immediate banning of padlocks on fire exits, making it a felony across Canada and much of the world. The aftermath of the fire was a long, painful process of recovery for the survivors and the families of the victims. Mark never set foot in a crowded bar again. For years, the smell of gasoline or the sound of country music was enough to send him back to that smoke-filled room. The old building on Union Avenue was eventually torn down, but the space where it stood remained empty for a long time, as if the land itself was trying to remember the people who had been lost there. The image of those heavy iron bolt cutters sitting on the sidewalk after the fire used to finally snap the padlock that had killed so many became a haunting symbol of the tragedy. It was a reminder that sometimes the smallest and most mundane objects, a lock, a bar, a wooden stairwell, can become the instruments of a mass casualty event when they are combined with human malice. The silence of the abandoned lounge was a testament to the lives that had been cut short. The smoke from the arson in Montreal eventually settled, but it left behind a world that was much more cautious about the doors it chose to lock. But while the fire at the wagon wheel was a crime born of human revenge, the disaster that was about to occur on a German rail line was a crime of physics and mechanical betrayal. In a place where luxury and speed were the only goals, a tiny plastic gear was preparing to derail a nation's faith in its own engineering. At 6:48 on a freezing Tuesday evening in February of 1971, a 42-year-old businessman named Klaus was sitting in the dining car of the Trans-Europe Express known as the Bavaria. Klaus was a man who appreciated the finer things in life, and there was no finer way to travel through West Germany than on the TEE. The car was a masterpiece of mid-century design, featuring plush velvet seating and warm low lighting that made the winter outside feel far away. To Klaus and the other passengers in the dining car, the train felt like a private club that happened to be moving at high speed across the continent. The windows were large and double-paned, designed to seal out the biting winter wind and the rhythmic clatter of the tracks. Inside it was a world of white linen tablecloths, heavy silver cutlery, and the quiet professional movements of waiters in crisp white jackets who were currently serving a five-course gourmet meal to the wealthy travelers. The Bavaria route was a source of national pride, a symbol of a country that had rebuilt itself into a modern industrial powerhouse. It was famous for its punctuality and its incredible smoothness. As Klaus lifted a heavy porcelain cup of dark coffee to his lips, he barely felt any movement at all. The liquid in the cup did not even ripple. It was a testament to the engineering of the tracks and the sophisticated suspension of the luxurious cars beneath him as they glided through the hills. Klaus was traveling from Munich toward Zurich, and he had made this trip many times before over the years. He knew the rhythm of the journey, the specific points where the train would lean gently into a curve or slow down for a small village station. On this particular evening, the landscape outside was a blur of dark pine forests and snow-covered fields, illuminated only by the occasional golden glow of a farmhouse window. Everything felt perfectly safe, comfortable, and entirely predictable. However, as he was waiting for the waiter to bring the dessert course, Klaus noticed a very small, very unusual detail. He had placed his silver spoon on the edge of his saucer, but instead of staying put, the spoon began to slide slowly toward the left. He picked it up and repositioned it, but a moment later it happened again. It was not a sudden jolt, but a persistent sideways pull that made him feel as if the entire dining car was starting to tilt at an unnatural angle. Klaus looked around the car to see if anyone else noticed the change in the floor's level. Most of the passengers were still deep in conversation, their voices muffled by the thick carpets and upholstered walls. But then he saw a glass of red wine at the next table. The liquid inside was not just rippling anymore, it was surging against the side of the glass. The tilt was becoming more pronounced, and for the first time that evening, Klaus felt a faint cold prickle of unease in his chest. He tried to reassure himself with his usual logic. The train was approaching the town of Eitrang, and he knew there was a significant S-curve in the tracks nearby. The engineers would surely be slowing down to the 80-km/h limit for that section. He assumed the tilt was just the natural effect of the train navigating the bend. He leaned back in his seat, trying to relax, but he noticed that the pitch of the engine's hum was not dropping as it usually should have. In fact, the hum seemed to be rising in frequency, turning into a high-pitched whine that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of his shoes. Klaus looked out the window, trying to judge their speed by the passing trees, but the darkness made it impossible. The train felt like it was accelerating, not slowing down. The silver spoon finally slid off the saucer entirely and clattered onto the white linen, but the sound was drowned out by a sudden, violent, and sickening lurch. Inside the locomotive at the front of the train, the driver was staring at his instrument panel. He was an experienced engineer with a spotless record, and he was doing everything exactly by the book. He had his hand on the throttle, and his eyes were fixed on the large circular speedometer in the center of the console. The needle was hovering perfectly at 80 km/h, which was the exact speed required for the dangerous curve he was about to enter according to the law. The driver felt the same tilt that Klaus felt in the dining car, but he did not panic. According to his instruments, he was well within the safety limits. He did not know that deep inside the Italian-made locomotive, a tiny, unassuming gear made of molded plastic had just reached its breaking point. The teeth of the gear had stripped away, meaning the speedometer was no longer connected to the wheels. The needle was frozen at 80, while the train was actually doing 130. This phenomenon is known in engineering circles as ghost speed. To the driver, the world appeared to be moving at a safe and controlled pace because that is what his mechanical reality told him. But the laws of physics do not care about a broken plastic gear. As the five-car luxury express hit the sharpest part of the S-curve near Atrang, the centrifugal force became an invisible hand reaching out and lifting the multi-ton steel cars off the rails and into the freezing night. Air. In the dining car, Klaus did not have time to shout. The world suddenly flipped on its side. The heavy porcelain plates and silver cutlery turned into projectiles flying across the room as the windows on the left side of the car shattered against the frozen ground. Klaus was thrown from his seat, his shoulder slamming into a luggage rack as the car began to tumble. The sound was like 1,000 sheets of metal being crushed at once, a roar that obliterated every other sense. The train did not just derail, it disintegrated. The luxury cars built for comfort rather than impact twisted and snapped as they rolled down a steep embankment and into a frozen streambed. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise of the crash. For a few seconds, the only sound was the hiss of escaping steam and the soft, rhythmic patter of snow falling onto the wreckage. Klaus lay in the darkness, his breath coming in short, agonizing gasps of cold air. He struggled to move his fingers, brushing against something cold and wet. He realized it was the snow coming in through the broken windows. He could hear the distant, muffled moans of other passengers, but he could not see anything. The low amber lighting of the dining car was gone, replaced by a suffocating, pitch-black void. As his mind began to clear from the initial shock, he heard a new sound in the distance, a low, rhythmic thrum that made the ground beneath him vibrate. It was the sound of another train. A local commuter rail line was approaching from the opposite direction, and the driver of that train had no way of knowing that the tracks ahead were blocked by the shattered remains of the Trans-Europe Express. Klaus tried to move to find a way to signal the approaching danger, but his legs were pinned beneath a heavy velvet seat. He watched through a gap in the wreckage as a single white headlight appeared in the distance, growing larger and brighter. The second collision was a dull, heavy thud that sent a new wave of debris flying through the air. The local train plowed directly into the wreckage of the dining car at 60 kilometers per hour. Klaus felt the impact through his entire body, a final crushing force that seemed to push the air out of his lungs forever. He closed his eyes, the smell of diesel fuel and ozone filling the air, and for a long time, he felt as if he were drifting away on a cold, silent, and endless river. When the rescue teams finally arrived from the town of Atrang, they were met with a scene that looked like a battlefield. They moved through the snow with flashlights, their beams dancing across the twisted metal and the shattered glass. They found Klaus nearly 2 hours later, still pinned beneath the seat. He was severely injured, but he was alive. As they lifted him onto a stretcher, he looked back at the remains of the dining car, the white tablecloths now stained with red and oil. The investigation into the Atrang derailment lasted for months. Experts from the German Federal Railways dismantled the locomotive piece by piece, trying to understand how such a sophisticated machine could have failed so catastrophically. When they finally found the stripped plastic gear in the speedometer network, the room went silent. They realized that 28 people had lost their lives because of a part that cost less than a few marks to manufacture in a factory. The disaster forced a complete overhaul of automatic train stop systems across the European continent. It led to the universal implementation of the Indusi system, which uses magnets on the tracks to monitor a train's speed independently of the driver's console. If a train exceeds the limit for a curve, the system automatically triggers the emergency brakes. The era of trusting a single mechanical dial was replaced by a system of checks and balances that could see through ghost speed. Klaus eventually recovered from his physical injuries, but the psychological scars remained for the rest of his life. He never traveled by train again, preferring to drive himself wherever he needed to go. He could not shake the memory of the silver spoon sliding across the table, the first sign that the world was no longer under control. For him, the sound of a train whistle in the distance would always be a trigger, a reminder of the night the pride of engineering failed. One of the most haunting images reported by the first responders was found in the debris of the dining car. They found a single porcelain plate, miraculously unbroken, sitting upright in the snow. On the plate was a perfectly preserved piece of chocolate cake, the fork still resting neatly beside it. It was a silent, frozen moment of luxury sitting in the middle of a graveyard, a reminder of how quickly a night of comfort can turn into a struggle for survival in the freezing dark. The plate of cake sat there as a final eerie testament to the lives that were interrupted in the blink of an eye. But while the disaster at Atrang was a tragedy born of a mechanical betrayal in the cold German winter, a different kind of horror was being carried out half a world away. In the humid, sun-drenched jungles of Thailand, the tools of industry were not being used for luxury or speed. Instead, they were being repurposed into a grim machine designed to erase people. In those remote jungle provinces, the industrial objects were not locomotives or silver spoons, they were simple 200-liter oil drums painted a bright primary red. To the villagers living in the shadow of the mountains, those drums were not symbols of progress or energy. They were the centerpieces of a state-sanctioned nightmare where the evidence of a person's life could be turned to ash in a matter of hours, leaving behind nothing but a heavy, terrifying silence. The red drums were used by military units to deal with those suspected of communist sympathies during a time of intense political paranoia. There were no trials, no luxury dining cars, and no instruments to record the truth. Suspects were rounded up in the middle of the night and brought to jungle clearings where the drums were waiting. It was a localized, industrialized form of execution that operated in the shadows far from the eyes of the international press or the law. The process was as simple as it was horrific. The victims were beaten unconscious and then placed inside the drums, which were filled with waste oil and tires. The drums were then set on fire, creating a heat so intense that it consumed everything. For the families left behind, there were no stretchers, no rescue teams, and no explanations. Their loved ones simply vanished into the red metal containers, their identities erased by a government that valued silence over justice. This was a crime of intention, a dark mirror to the mechanical accident in Germany. While the people in Atrang were victims of a broken gear, the thousands who disappeared in the red drums were victims of a broken society. The silence of the Thai jungle was not the peaceful quiet of a snowy evening, but a manufactured void where the truth was burned away, leaving behind a haunting afterimage of red metal sitting abandoned in the thick, humid undergrowth of the forest. At 6 o'clock on a humid evening in November of 1972, a 30-year-old rice farmer named Somsak was walking behind his water buffalo in the remote Phot Talung province of southern Thailand. The air was thick and heavy, smelling of damp earth and ripening grain. For Somsak, this was the most peaceful time of day. The sun was dipping behind the jagged limestone cliffs, casting long purple shadows across the vibrant green paddies that stretched toward the jungle. Somsak lived in a small wooden house on stilts with his wife and three young children. Their life was defined by the ancient rhythms of the land, the arrival of the monsoon, and the shared labor of the harvest. It was a simple, predictable existence that felt insulated from the outside world. To Somsak, the village was a sanctuary where the only dangers were the occasional cobra in the tall grass or a sudden heavy storm that might flatten the young rice plants. But even in this paradise, there were whispers of a growing shadow. For years, the mountainous jungles surrounding the province had been home to small groups of rebels. The central government in Bangkok was terrified that these insurgents would spread their ideology to the rural farmers. Because of this, the military had a constant, low-level presence in the region. Somsak would often see soldiers patrolling the main roads, their green uniforms looking out of place against the mud. Despite the military presence, Somsak felt he had nothing to fear. He was not a political man. He was a farmer who cared only for his family and his fields. He believed that as long as he worked hard and kept to himself, the storms of the world would pass him by. He would often wave politely at the soldiers as they drove past in their heavy trucks, and they would usually nod back. It was a quiet, uneasy peace that both sides had agreed to maintain for a long time. On this particular evening, as Somsak reached his house and began to wash the mud from his legs, he heard the sound of an engine approaching from the village square. It was not the usual light buzz of a motorcycle, but the heavy rhythmic thud of a large diesel truck. He paused his heart, giving a small, unexplained flutter. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the clanking of metal chains and the shouting of commands. It was the sound of a military operation moving into his backyard. Somsak's wife came out onto the porch, her face pale, as she looked toward the road. A large, olive-drab truck pulled to a halt right in front of their home. 6 soldiers jumped out of the back, their boots hitting the dry ground with a series of sharp, aggressive thuds. They weren't the usual young conscripts Somsak saw on the roads. These men looked older, their faces hardened by years of jungle warfare, and they were carrying their rifles at the ready, not slung over their shoulders. A man in a crisp officer's uniform stepped forward. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a professional businessman who happened to be wearing camouflage. He looked at a clipboard and then up at Somsak. He asked if he was the man who owned the fields near the edge of the forest. Somsak nodded his throat, suddenly feeling very dry. The officer smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. He told Somsak that they just needed him to come to the camp for a quick chat. The officer explained that they were conducting a routine security sweep and needed to ask a few questions about some people who had been seen near the forest. He assured Somsak and his terrified wife that it was just a formality. He said Somsak would be back in time for dinner or perhaps the next morning at the latest. It was such a reasonable, polite request that Somsak felt a wave of relief. He told his wife not to worry, kissed his children, and climbed into the back of the truck. As the truck pulled away, Somsak sat on a hard wooden bench between 2 silent soldiers. He tried to start a conversation asking about the weather or the rice prices, but they stared straight ahead as if he wasn't there. The truck turned off the main road and began to climb into the foothills. The familiar sights of the village were replaced by dense primary jungle. The air grew cooler, and the only sound was the roar of the engine and the branches scraping against the canvas roof. After an hour of driving, they reached a secluded facility surrounded by a high perimeter fence. This was the Banthang camp, a site operated by the Internal Security Operations Command. To the outside world, it was a training base. But as Somsak was led through the gate, he noticed a strange detail. There were no barracks or shooting ranges. Instead, there were several large open clearings filled with rows of industrial objects that looked completely out of place in a military camp. In the center of the first clearing, Somsak saw dozens of 200-liter oil drums. They were painted a bright primary red, the color of a warning flare. They were stacked in neat rows, their metallic surfaces reflecting the fading sunlight. Somsak wondered why the military needed so much fuel in such a remote place. Then he noticed that some of the drums were standing upright and had been modified. Their tops had been removed and large holes had been punched into the sides. Somsak was led into a small, windowless concrete building. The chat the officer had promised turned out to be an intense, grueling interrogation that lasted for hours. They accused him of providing food and shelter to the rebels in the jungle. They didn't ask questions so much as they shouted statements. Somsak denied everything, his voice growing ragged as he pleaded his innocence. He explained that he was just a farmer, but the men in the room only looked at him with cold, bored eyes. As the night wore on, the interrogation became more physical. Somsak was beaten until he could no longer stand, his vision blurring and his head thumping with a rhythmic, agonizing pain. He realized then that these men didn't care about the truth. They were part of a systemic machine designed to create a result, not to find a criminal. They needed names to fill their reports, and it didn't matter if those names were innocent. Somsak felt a terrifying void opening up beneath him. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, the door to the room opened and a new group of soldiers entered. They weren't carrying clipboards or recording devices. They were carrying heavy coils of rope and a large plastic jug that smelled of stale gasoline and waste oil. They didn't say a word to Somsak as they hauled him up from the floor. He tried to fight, but his body was too broken to resist. They dragged him out of the building and toward the clearing where the red drums were waiting. The air in the clearing was cool, but it was filled with a scent that made Somsak's stomach turn. It was the smell of old tires, burnt hair, and something sweet and heavy that he couldn't quite identify. As he was dragged closer to the drums, he saw that several of them were already smoking a low gray haze drifting up toward the jungle canopy. He heard a faint rhythmic scratching sound coming from inside one of the containers, followed by a muffled, desperate thumping. It was in that moment that the horrific truth of the red drums finally penetrated Somsak's mind. This wasn't a prison or a training camp. This was an industrialized eraser. The military had found a way to deal with suspects that left behind no evidence, no bodies, and no legal trail. If there was no body, there was no crime. The red drums were not for fuel, they were for people. Somsak felt a wave of pure, white-hot terror wash over him, a sensation that made his heart feel as if it would burst. The soldiers didn't waste any time. They beat Somsak until he was nearly unconscious, his head lolling to the side as he struggled to breathe. Then they lifted him up and dropped him into one of the empty red drums. The metal was cold against his skin, and the space was so narrow that he was forced into a tight fetal position. He looked up and saw a small circle of the night sky, the stars looking down on him with a cold indifference that felt like a final betrayal. Then he heard the sound of liquid being poured into the drum. It was a heavy, viscous splash that coated his legs and back. It was waste oil mixed with gasoline and scraps of old rubber tires. The soldiers were creating a fuel source that would burn slow and hot, ensuring that everything inside the drum would be reduced to ash. Somsak tried to scream to beg for mercy, but the words were caught in his throat. He watched as a soldier reached down and struck a single small match. The fire didn't start with a bang, it started with a soft, hungry hiss. A single flame danced on the surface of the oil for a second before spreading into a bright orange wall. The heat was instantaneous and absolute, a physical force that seemed to melt the very air. Somsak's world was suddenly reduced to a roar of fire and the smell of his own life being consumed. It was a pain beyond description, a sensation that lasted only for a few frantic minutes before the darkness finally took him. While Somsak was being erased in the jungle, his wife was sitting on the porch of their house watching the sun rise over the rice paddies. She expected to see the military truck return at any moment, bringing her husband home as promised. She spent the entire day waiting, her eyes fixed on the road, but the only things she saw were the buffalo in the fields and the distant purple peaks of the cliffs. The truck never came back, and the silence of the village began to feel like a shroud. She went to the local military headquarters to ask about Somsak, but the officers there looked at her with blank, empty expressions. They told her they had no record of any man by that name being taken for questioning. They suggested that perhaps her husband had decided to join the rebels in the mountains after all. They spoke with such calm, bureaucratic certainty that for a moment she almost believed them. But she knew Somsak, and she knew that he would never have left his children behind. This was the terrifying genius of the Red Drum Purges. Over 3,000 people vanished in the southern provinces of Thailand between 1972 and 1975. They weren't just killed, they were deleted from history. Because the military controlled the camps and the drums, there were no graves for the families to visit and no physical evidence for human rights groups to find. The red drum became a symbol of a state that had turned its own tools of industry against its people. For years, the truth remained hidden behind a wall of military secrecy and state-sanctioned amnesia. It wasn't until a decade later, when a group of courageous student activists and local villagers began to explore the abandoned clearings in the Phatalung jungles, that the evidence finally emerged. They found thousands of tiny calcified bone fragments and the rusted, charred remains of the red drums hidden beneath layers of forest floor and new growth. The jungle had tried to hide the crime, but it couldn't erase the iron. The families of the disappeared finally had a place to mourn, though they would never have a body to bury. The Red Drum Purges remain a deep, unhealed scar in the history of Thailand, a reminder of what happens when a government operates in total darkness. The image of those rusted red containers sitting silent in a jungle clearing is a haunting testament to the 3,000 lives that were turned into ash because of a paranoid ideology and a simple 200-liter oil drum. Somsak's house in the village eventually fell into ruin, the wooden stilts rotting away as the jungle reclaimed the land. His children grew up knowing only that their father had disappeared on a Tuesday evening after a polite conversation with an officer. They would walk past the green rice paddies and look toward the mountains, wondering if he was still out there somewhere. But the only answer they ever received was the rustle of the leaves and the distant rhythmic thud of a truck on the main road. The silence of the Thai jungle was a heavy, suffocating void where the truth was burned away, leaving behind a haunting afterimage of red metal. But while the state used industry to hide its crimes in Asia, a different kind of silence was being prepared in the political heart of East Africa. In the lush green canopy of the Ngong forest in Kenya, a popular hero was about to discover that the people he trusted to lead his nation were the ones who had already signed his death warrant in a luxury hotel. The forest in Kenya was just as beautiful and just as indifferent as the jungle in Fatulung. It was a place of deep shadows and ancient secrets, where the sound of the wind through the trees could mask the sound of a government limousine pulling into a secluded clearing. In that silence, a man who spoke for 10 million beggars was about to meet a fate that would push a young nation to the absolute brink of an open revolution, all because of a gap in his teeth and a promise made in a lobby. The transition from the heat of the red drums to the cool shadows of the Ngong forest is a journey across continents, but the story remains the same. It is the story of power, silence, and the moments when the world we think we know is revealed to be a much darker and more dangerous place. The silence that follows a hero's disappearance is a sound that everyone can hear, a vibration that travels through the earth and into the bones of those who are left behind to search for the truth in the ash. On a bright and crisp autumn morning in June of 1975, a young woman stood on the side of a highway in New Zealand, smiling as she watched a very specific vehicle pull over. It was a vintage Morris station wagon, but it was not just any car. It was painted a shade of neon orange, so loud and so vibrant that it practically burned your eyes against the deep green backdrop of the pine forests. Multiple people saw her get in. Multiple people saw that orange car driving down the road. But within just a few hours, that impossible-to-miss car and that smiling girl would vanish into thin air, leaving behind a mystery that would haunt an entire nation for over 50 years. Welcome back to the campfire, everyone. I am really glad you could join me tonight. Today, we are diving into an epic 12-story marathon, traveling all the way from the islands of New Zealand to the mountains of Romania and the crowded streets of Japan. These are stories from the early 1970s that prove the world can turn on a dime when you least expect it. If you enjoy these deep dives into the dark and mysterious, go ahead and gently nudge that like button. Just a light tap. We do not want to wake whatever might be hiding in the shadows, but we do want them to know we are on to them. Before we get into the details of our first story, please take a second to make sure your front door is actually locked. Go ahead and check the feed on your doorbell camera too. It is a quiet night out there, and as you will see in today's episode, that is usually when things get the most interesting. We have a massive journey ahead of us tonight, so settle in, get comfortable, and keep your ears open. You are listening to a series of events that changed history forever. Now, let us get back to that bright orange car on the side of the road. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning on June 1st, 1975, in the city of Hamilton, New Zealand, an 18-year-old student named Mona Blades was standing on her driveway adjusting the straps of her orange and brown canvas backpack. The air was cool and carried the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, typical for the start of the winter season in the Southern Hemisphere. Mona was a vibrant, independent young woman with a smile that made people feel like they had known her for years, and today she was on a mission. Mona was planning to surprise her family for the Queen's birthday holiday weekend. They lived in Napier on the other side of the North Island, and she had decided that rather than taking a bus or a train, she would save her money and hitchhike. To a modern ear, that sounds like a terrifying risk, But in 1975 New Zealand, it was just the way people moved. It was a small island nation where nobody locked their doors, and every stranger was just a friend you had not met yet. Hitchhiking was the social network of the 70s. She said goodbye to her roommate, promising to call as soon as she arrived, and walked toward the edge of town. Her boots made a rhythmic crunching sound on the gravel shoulder of State Highway 1. Mona felt completely safe. She had grown up in this landscape, she knew the roads, and she possessed that golden, youthful sense of invincibility. She found a good spot near the Cambridge turnoff, stuck out her thumb, and waited. The sun was shining, the sky was a deep, cloudless blue, and the holiday traffic was starting to pick up speed. For the first 30 minutes, several cars passed her by, their drivers waving, but their seats already full of families and camping gear. Then, a vehicle appeared on the horizon that was impossible to ignore. It was a 1960s Morris Traveller, a small station wagon with distinctive wooden structural framing on the back half. But what really made it stand out was the paint. It was a fluorescent neon orange. It looked like a child's toy that had been scaled up to full size. It pulled over with a squeal of brakes, and Mona climbed inside laughing. Several independent witnesses saw this happen. A truck driver recalled seeing the girl with the orange pack chatting with a middle-aged man behind the wheel. Another holiday traveler remembered the orange car because it was so ugly it was actually charming. As the car pulled back onto the asphalt and headed south toward the volcanic plateau, Mona was probably talking about her studies or her excitement to see her parents. She had no way of knowing that every mile they traveled was taking her further away from the world she knew and into a void. By 11 o'clock, the orange car was seen again near the town of Putaruru. Witnesses described the driver as a man in his 40s with thinning hair and a nondescript face. He was not speeding, he was just another traveler in the holiday rush. But as they entered the region of the North Island, known for its massive state-owned pine forests, the landscape began to change. The open fields were replaced by walls of dark green timber that grew so thick they seemed to swallow the light. The road became a narrow ribbon of gray, winding through a silent wooden labyrinth. Around 12:30, a family driving toward Lake Taupo saw the orange Morris parked in a small gravel rest area near a place called the Matea Road. They remembered it specifically because the bright orange paint looked violent against the somber green of the trees. They saw a young woman matching Mona's description standing by the passenger door looking through her backpack as if she were searching for a map or a snack. The man was standing near the front of the car, looking off into the trees. She did not look distressed. She looked perfectly normal. This is where the story takes a turn into the impossible. The rest area, where the car was seen, is located on a long, straight stretch of highway with very few turnoffs. There were hundreds of cars on the road that day, a constant stream of witnesses. Yet after that moment at the rest area, the orange car simply vanished. It did not pass through the next police checkpoint. It did not pull into any of the gas stations in Taupo. It was a neon orange object in a world of green and gray, and it had somehow been erased from the map in broad daylight. When Mona did not show up in Napier that evening, her parents initially thought she had just changed her plans. But as the hours turned into a full day, that casual concern turned into a cold, paralyzing fear. Mona was a girl of her word. She would have called. Her father contacted the police, and within 48 hours, New Zealand was launched into the largest search operation in its history. They called it Operation Mona, and it involved thousands of volunteers, military helicopters, and every police officer on the North Island. The investigators were confident at first. They had a description of a car that was one of a kind. They assumed they would find it sitting in a garage or abandoned in a ditch within days. They tracked down every single Morris Traveller registered in the country, over 500 of them. They went to every house, every farm, and every scrapyard. They found white ones, blue ones, and even a few red ones. But they never found a single orange one that had been on the highway that day. It was as if the car itself was a hallucination. The search teams moved into the pine forests, walking in long, disciplined lines through the thick gorse and undergrowth. They searched the deep pumice caves and the icy mountain streams that run through the volcanic plateau. Divers were sent into the depths of Lake Taupo, and helicopters with thermal sensors scanned the canopy at night. They found old campsites, discarded trash, and even a few stolen cars from years ago. But they found nothing that belonged to Mona. Not a scrap of her clothing, not a thread from her orange pack, and certainly no sign of the car. As the weeks turned into months, the silence from the forest became a heavy weight on the national conscience. The police interviewed over 1,000 people. They followed leads that took them to the South Island and even to Australia. They looked into local hermits, gang members, and long haul truckers. Every lead ended in a dead end. The man with the thinning hair and the orange car remained ghosts. It was as if the road had opened up and swallowed them whole, closing back up without leaving a single tire mark or a footprint in the gravel. The impact on New Zealand society was profound and permanent. The Queen's birthday disappearance was the moment the country realized that the world was no longer small and safe. The culture of hitchhiking, which had been a staple of Kiwi life for generations, died almost overnight. Parents who used to let their children walk miles to school began to drive them to the front gate. The trust that had defined the island for a century was replaced by a widespread, lingering paranoia. The disappearance of Mona Blades was the end of the country's innocence. Decades passed, and the case became a permanent fixture in the annals of cold cases. Every few years, a new witness would come forward, or a new piece of land would be cleared, sparking a fresh round of excavations. In the 1990s, a man claimed on his deathbed that he knew where the car was buried, leading to a massive dig in a rural backyard. They found nothing but old farm equipment and dirt. The orange car continued to taunt the investigators from the shadows of history, a bright, taunting memory that refused to be solved. Even today, if you drive along State Highway 1 through the volcanic plateau, you will see people pull over at that same rest area near Matea Road. They look into the trees, wondering if the forest is still holding on to the secret. The case of Mona Blades remains a haunting reminder that even the most visible things can disappear if the shadows are deep enough. The bright orange car is still out there somewhere, a ghost of the 1970s highway, waiting for someone to find the one detail that everyone missed in the sunlight. The silence that settled over the New Zealand highway after Mona vanished was a heavy, suffocating kind of quiet, but it was nothing compared to the silence that was about to be broken in a gray apartment complex in Japan. While the mystery of the orange car was born in the wide open spaces of the forest, our next story takes place in a world where the walls are so thin you can hear your neighbor's heartbeat. And in that world, the smallest sound was about to become a trigger for a nightmare that no one saw coming. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon on August 28, 1974, in the city of Kawaguchi, Japan, a 35-year-old mother named Mrs. Okamura was standing in her kitchen listening to a sound that usually brought her peace. In the next room, her 8-year-old daughter was sitting at a piano practicing her daily scales. The notes were repetitive and simple, do, re, mi, fa, echoing through the small apartment. To Mrs. Okamura, it was the sound of a bright future, but to the man living on the other side of the wall, it was the sound of his mind slowly coming apart. The sun is beginning its long, slow descent behind the jagged peaks of the mountains far to the west. It is that time of evening when the sky turns a deep, bruised shade of indigo, and the first few stars begin to poke through the veil of the coming night like tiny flickering candles. You can feel the air start to change, losing the sharp, dry heat of the afternoon and taking on a cool, damp softness that seems to settle over everything like a heavy, invisible blanket. As the light fades, the sounds of the day begin to retreat, replaced by the gentle, rhythmic music of the evening. Somewhere in the distance, a lone owl calls out from the deep shadows of an ancient oak tree, its voice low and steady, a signal to the world that it is time to slow down. The rustle of the dry leaves on the forest floor sounds like a soft collective sigh, as if the earth itself is finally exhaling after a long and busy day of growth and movement. Now imagine that you are standing at the edge of a wide open meadow. The tall grass is swaying slowly in a light cooling breeze, and the wildflowers are bowing their heads as if they are falling into a deep, dreamless sleep. There is no urgency here, no need to rush, and no place you need to be other than right where you are. The horizon is glowing with a faint, ghostly silver light from a moon that has not yet fully risen, but you can feel its presence watching over the land. You begin to walk slowly toward the tree line, your feet moving silently over the soft, damp moss that cushions every step. The trees here are tall and ancient, their branches interlocking high above your head, like the vaulted ceiling of a cathedral made of needles and bark. The air inside the forest is even cooler and smells of pine and damp stone. It is a place where time seems to have slowed to a crawl, and the only thing that matters is the steady, rhythmic pulse of the living world. Deep in the heart of these woods, a small stream trickles over smooth gray stones, making a sound that is like 1,000 tiny bells ringing softly in the dark. The water is clear and cold, moving with a purpose that is both ancient and gentle. You sit down on a fallen log near the water's edge and simply listen to the flow. The sound is hypnotic, a constant low-frequency hum that seems to vibrate right through you, pulling the tension from your shoulders and the weight from your mind. As you sit there, you notice the small creatures of the forest settling in for the night. A squirrel curls into a tight ball inside a hollow knot in a tree, and a family of deer finds a secluded thicket where the grass is soft and long. They are safe and warm, protected by the shadows and the silence of the trees. There is a sense of profound security in the way the forest takes care of its own, and you realize that you are a part of this world too, tucked into the safety of the coming night. The wind begins to whisper through the tops of the pines, a sound that is like the distant crashing of waves on a sandy shore. It is a soft, rushing noise that rises and falls in perfect time with your own breathing. You find yourself inhaling as the wind picks up and exhaling as it dies away until your movements and the movements of the world around you are perfectly synchronized. It is a feeling of being completely connected to the earth, a feeling of being exactly where you belong. Far away beyond the forest and the meadow, the great mountain peaks are turning into dark, solid silhouettes against the starry sky. The snow on their summits catches the starlight and glows with a pale blue luminescence. Those peaks have stood there for millions of years, watching the sun set and the moon rise, and they will be there long after the night has passed. Their presence is grounding and solid, a reminder that some things in this world are constant, unchanging, and forever at peace. Now turn your mind toward the great deserts of the Southwest. There, the sand is finally giving up the heat of the sun, and the dunes are turning into vast rolling waves of silver and shadow. The silence there is absolute, a silence so deep that you can almost hear the stars spinning in their orbits. The cacti stand like tall, silent guardians under the moon, their shadows stretching out over the cooling earth. It is a landscape of profound stillness where the very air seems to be holding its breath. Imagine the high Arctic where the world is an endless expanse of white and blue. The snow falls in soft, heavy flakes that make no sound as they land on the frozen ground. The northern lights are dancing across the sky in curtains of green and violet, moving with a liquid grace that defies description. The world there is cold but peaceful, a place where the ice and the wind have reached an agreement of silence. Everything is tucked under a layer of frost, sleeping soundly in the deep winter dark. Think of the vast, deep oceans that cover most of our world. Deep beneath the surface, far away from the wind and the waves, the water is a constant, soothing blue. The great whales are moving slowly through the depths, their low-frequency songs traveling for hundreds of miles through the heavy silence of the sea. The tide is pulling away from the shore now, a long, slow retreat that follows the command of the moon. The ocean is breathing a massive, slow lung that fills and empties with the tide. Now, bring your focus back closer to home. Imagine a small, quiet town nestled in a valley, its cobblestone streets empty and silent under the glow of a few flickering lamps. The shop windows are dark, and the signs swing slowly in the evening air with a faint, rhythmic creak. The gardens are full of shadows, and the iron gates are closed tight for the night. It is a place where everyone has gone inside, where the fires are burning low in the grates and the heavy curtains have been drawn. You walk down one of these quiet streets, the sound of your footsteps muted by the night air. Every house you pass is a sanctuary of warmth and light, a place where people are resting and dreaming. You reach a small house at the end of the lane, a house that feels familiar and safe. The oak floors inside are polished and dark, reflecting the faint light from the moon through the windows. The air inside is warm and smells of old books and dried lavender, a scent that reminds you of peace. You walk slowly up the stairs, each step a deliberate movement toward rest. The hallway is long and narrow, with shadows that dance on the walls as you pass. At the end of the hall is a door, and as you open it, you enter a room that is perfectly prepared for your arrival. The curtains are heavy and thick, blocking out the world and keeping the silence inside. The bed is large and soft, with layers of heavy blankets and pillows that feel like they are made of clouds and starlight. As you lie down, you feel the weight of the day finally lifting away from your body. Your feet feel light, your legs feel heavy and warm, and your back sinks deep into the softness of the mattress. You pull the blankets up to your chin, feeling the smooth, cool texture of the sheets against your skin. The room is dark, save for a tiny sliver of moonlight that peeks through the curtains, casting a soft blue glow on the floor. It is a room where nothing can reach you, a room where you are safe. Listen to the sound of your own heart. It is a steady, rhythmic beat, a drum that has been playing since before you were born. It doesn't need to work hard now, it just needs to keep time with the night. Your breath is coming slow and easy, a gentle rise and fall of your chest that mimics the movement of the tide and the wind in the trees. With every exhale, you let go of a little more of the world. With every inhale, you draw in the peace and the silence of the room. The thoughts in your mind are like small boats on a vast, calm lake. They are drifting slowly away from the shore, their sails catching a light breeze that carries them out toward the center of the water. You don't need to follow them, you just watch them go until they are nothing more than tiny dots on the horizon. The water of the lake is dark and still reflecting the stars above. It is a place of absolute clarity and absolute rest, a place where the mind can finally be quiet. You are drifting now, suspended in a state that is neither fully awake nor fully asleep. It is a floating sensation, as if you are being carried along by a slow-moving river of light and shadow. The sounds of the world are very far away now, nothing more than a faint, distant hum that doesn't require your attention. The silence of the room is your only companion, and it is a kind and gentle friend. It wraps around you like a cocoon, protecting you as you prepare for the long journey into sleep. Your eyelids feel incredibly heavy, as if they are made of the same ancient stone as the mountain peaks. They want to close, and you find that you have no desire to keep them open. When they finally flutter shut, the darkness is not empty. It is a rich, velvety space filled with the potential for dreams. It is a space where you can be anything and go anywhere, but for now, you are content to simply be still. You are floating in the deep indigo of the coming night, safe and warm. The world outside continues to turn, the stars continue to spin, and the moon continues to rise, but you are separate from all of that now. You are in the sanctuary of your own rest, a place where the rules of the day do not apply. There is no tomorrow, yet only the perfect unfolding now of the evening. The silence is absolute, the warmth is constant, and the peace is profound. You are tucked in, you are looked after, and you are ready. Imagine the spirit of the night walking through the world, checking every lock and every gate, making sure that every creature is safe in its nest. It moves like a shadow, silent and graceful, touching the foreheads of the sleeping with a cool, gentle hand. It brings the gift of forgetfulness, the gift of rest, and the gift of the dream. It is a guardian that has been here since the beginning of time, and it is watching over you right now, ensuring that your sleep is deep and undisturbed. The distant sound of a train whistle echoes through the valley, a long, mournful note that sounds like a lullaby for the travelers. It is a reminder that the world is vast and beautiful, but that your corner of it is small and secure. The whistle fades away into the silence, leaving the night even quieter than it was before. The darkness is soft, the bed is warm, and the blankets are heavy. You are drifting further and further away from the shore, out into the deep, calm waters of sleep. Everything is as it should be. The forest is quiet, the ocean is breathing, the desert is still, and you are safe. There is nothing left to do but let go. The night is a long, slow exhale that lasts until the sun begins its ascent in the morning. But the morning is a lifetime away, and for now, there is only the dark, the warmth, and the rhythm of your own heart. You are sinking deeper and deeper into the softness, falling away into the dream, perfectly at peace with the world. Think about the way the light catches the dust motes in a quiet room, even in the dark. There is a hidden life in the stillness, a secret language of the shadows that only the sleeping can understand. You are beginning to hear that language now, a series of soft, melodic hums that vibrate in the back of your mind. It is the sound of the universe resting, the sound of the great machine slowing down to a crawl. It is a beautiful, terrifyingly vast sound, but it is also deeply, profoundly comforting. You are like a single leaf on a great wide river, moving without effort, guided only by the flow of the water. The river is deep and slow, and the banks are lined with tall silver trees that bow toward you as you pass. There are no rocks here, no rapids, only the smooth, glassy surface of the stream. You are moving toward a great dark ocean where the dreams are born, and the journey is just as beautiful as the destination. You are safe, you are warm, and you are drifting. The air in your room is perfectly still now, a cool presence that settles on your skin like a light frost. But beneath the blankets, you are a furnace of warmth, a small, glowing ember in the vast darkness of the world. That warmth is your sanctuary, a heat that comes from within and protects you from the cold of the void. It is a life force that is steady and strong, a fire that burns low and quiet through the long hours of the night. You are secure. The house around you is settling, making small rhythmic creaks as the wood cools and the foundation rests. These sounds are familiar and grounding the heartbeat of the building that protects you. Each little pop and groan is a sign that the house is doing its job standing guard while you sleep. You can hear the faint hum of the electricity in the walls, a low-frequency drone that adds another layer to the evening's music. Everything is in its place and everything is exactly as it should be. Your mind is a vast, empty theater now, the stage dark and the curtains closed. The audience has gone home, and the lights have been turned down to a single glowing bulb in the center of the stage. This is the place where the dreams will soon begin to play, but for now, it is a space of pure, unadulterated potential. It is a silent room where anything can happen, but nothing needs to happen yet. You are just the observer waiting for the first flicker of the dream to begin. Think of the way the roots of the trees reach deep into the earth, anchoring them against the wind and the rain. You are anchored too, held fast by the weight of your own body and the comfort of your bed. No matter how far your mind wanders in the night, you will always be tethered to this place of safety. You can fly across the stars or swim to the bottom of the sea in your dreams, but your physical self remains right here, protected and warm until the light returns. The stars above are moving in their ancient slow dance tracing patterns that have been seen by eyes for thousands of years. They are silent witnesses to the night, each one a distant sun that offers its tiny bit of light to the darkness. Their light is millions of years old, a message from the past that reaches you just as you are falling into the future. It is a vast cosmic lullaby that reminds you of how small and precious this moment of rest truly is. Now let the last of the world fade away. Let the room, the house, the town, and the trees become nothing more than faint memories. There is only the darkness, the warmth, and the slow, steady rhythm of your breath. You are on the very edge of the deep blue sea of sleep, and the waves are lapping gently at your feet. The water is warm and inviting, and you are ready to let it carry you away. There is no more thinking, no more waiting, only the falling. You are falling into the softest, deepest velvet of the night. The silence is your blanket, and the stars are your guide. Every muscle in your body is completely relaxed, every cell is at rest, and every breath is a prayer of peace. You are being held by the world, cradled by the night, and loved by the silence. The journey into the dream has begun, and it is a journey of light, shadow, and absolute perfect rest. Close your eyes, let go, and sleep. The silence deepens until it is a physical presence in the room, a heavy velvet curtain that covers everything. You can no longer feel the boundaries of your own body. You have become one with the mattress, one with the blankets, and one with the air. You are a part of the darkness, now a small point of light in a vast indigo universe. The rhythm of your heart is the only clock that matters, and it is ticking slower and slower, moving in time with the spinning of the earth. The dreams are starting now, small flickers of light and color that dance on the inside of your eyelids. They are gentle and kind, the manifestations of your deepest hopes and your quietest thoughts. They take you by the hand and lead you out of the room, across the meadow, and up toward the stars. You are flying now, moving with a weightless grace that you only know in sleep. The world below is a beautiful, glowing marble of blue and white, and you are free. The night is a sanctuary, a place where you are allowed to be nothing at all. You don't need to be a worker, a student, a friend, or a family member. You just need to be a soul at rest, a part of the great cycle of the world. The stars are watching, the moon is guiding, and the darkness is protecting. You are tucked into the very heart of the universe, and it is a place of profound and perfect safety. Deep sleep is yours now. As the final moments of wakefulness slip away, you feel a sense of overwhelming gratitude for the night. You are thankful for the bed, the blankets, the silence, and the safety. You are thankful for the breath in your lungs and the heartbeat in your chest. The world is a good place, and the night is its most precious gift. You are sinking, drifting, falling, and finally you are gone into the deep, dark, and beautiful sea of a dreamless, perfect sleep. The spirit of the night stands at the foot of your bed, a silent guardian in the shadows. It watches over you with a calm and steady gaze, ensuring that nothing disturbs the peace of your rest. It knows the secrets of the dark and the power of the dream, and it uses that knowledge to keep you safe until the morning light breaks over the mountains. You are never truly alone in the night. You are always in the care of the guardian. Listen to the very last sound you can hear. It is the sound of the world ending and the dream beginning. It is a soft, rushing noise that fills your ears and your mind, a sound that is like a choir of angels singing in a language made of wind and water. It is the most beautiful thing you have ever heard, and it is the last thing you will hear before the silence takes over. The transition is complete. You are asleep. You are at rest. The moon reaches its highest point in the sky, casting a silver light over the sleeping world. The shadows are long and dark, and the night is at its deepest. Every creature is tucked away, every eye is closed, and every heart is at peace. The great exhale of the earth is at its peak, and the world is a place of absolute silent beauty. You are a part of that beauty now, a sleeping soul in a world of silver and shadow, safe, warm. In the morning, the sun will rise again, and the world will wake up to a new day of light and movement. But that is a story for another time. For now, the only story that matters is the story of the night, the story of the rest, and the story of the dream. You are safe in the arms of the evening, and you will stay there until the light returns to guide you home. Sleep now, and let the darkness take care of the rest. The darkness is a deep, warm well, and you are sinking slowly toward the bottom. The water is clear and still, and the light from above is a distant, flickering memory. You are surrounded by the peace of the depths, a place where the sounds of the world cannot reach you. Every movement is slow and graceful, and every breath is a bubble of light that rises toward the surface. You are at the very heart of the quiet, and it is a place of perfect rest. Imagine that your body is made of starlight, and you are dissolving into the night air. You are becoming a part of the wind, a part of the trees, and a part of the mountains. There is no more weight, no more solidness, only the feeling of being everywhere at once. You are the night itself, a vast and beautiful expanse of indigo and silver. You are free from the limitations of the world, free to drift and dream until the sun returns to bring you back. The last flicker of thought goes out like a candle in the wind. There is only the void, and it is a beautiful, welcoming place. It is the place where everything begins and everything ends, the cradle of the universe. You are tucked into that cradle, rocked by the motion of the galaxies, and sang to by the music of the spheres. The peace is absolute, the darkness is complete, and the sleep is final. You are at one with the night. The house is silent, the street is empty, and the world is asleep. You are dreaming now, and the dreams are taking you on a journey through landscapes of light and wonder. You are walking through forests of silver leaves and swimming through oceans of liquid starlight. You are happy, you are safe, and you are at peace. The night has done its work, and you are its masterpiece. Sleep deep, sleep long, and sleep soundly in the dark of the night. The stars are the only lights left in the universe, and they are shining just for you. They are the eyes of the night watching over you as you travel through the world of the dream. Their light is a gentle reminder that even in the deepest dark, there is always a source of beauty and hope. You are moving through that beauty now, a part of the great tapestry of the evening. Everything is quiet, everything is still, and everything is exactly as it should be. The air in the room is a soft caress on your cheek, a final goodbye from the waking world. You are fully committed to the sleep now, fully immersed in the velvet darkness. The blankets are a heavy, warm embrace that holds you fast, and the pillows are a soft landing for your head. You are at the very center of the universe, and it is a place of absolute safety. The long night is ahead of you, and it is a gift of rest. Sleep. Let the words fade into the background until they are nothing more than a faint, rhythmic hum. Let the room disappear and the world dissolve. There is only the sleep, the deep, dark, and beautiful sleep. You are safe, you are warm, you are at peace. The night is your home and the dream is your journey. Everything is quiet, everything is still. Close your eyes one last time, let go of the last thread of the world, and fall.